Hey everyone, this is chapter 3 of part 2 of Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West, the new reading of Marx in the Federal Republic since 1965. Part 2 of the book is titled Derivation of the State, and chapter 3 of part 2 is titled In the Crossfire, Problematizations and Clarifications. A historical materialism, and it has the headings, a historical materialism without history, on quote, economism and quote, circulationisms, dialectical development of legal and state forms, and democracy and its revenants. So, let's fucking rock. No strand of the, quote, new Marx reading became such a focal point of contention and criticism as that concerning the derivation of the state. It lent itself to this role for several reasons. For one, because it addressed in a forceful manner a subject central to the practice of emancipatory endeavors by means of the logically systematic principle of development characteristic of dialectical exposition. Both the political, strategic, and methodological implications of the state derivation had to be perceived as an overt provocation and an intellectual challenge by traditionally empirical political scientists as well as by Marxist-Leninist interpreters. Groups equally committed to state instrumentalism, the state monopoly capitalism approach, and the respective, quote, anti-monopolist Communist Party strategies. A further reason for the intense engagement with the central lines of argument within the derivation debate, aside from substantive ambiguities and conceptual missteps, was the inherent limitation of form-analytical state theory, a limitation that was in fact soon recognized even by the theory's own proponents. Accordingly, the following discussion will address criticisms, both internal and external to the paradigm, as well as proposals for expansion and refinement, provided they remain within the bounds of scholarly argumentation. This proviso is necessary because, particularly on the part of Marxist-Leninists, entire books were frequently filled with insinuations and invective that revealed not only the authors failed to grasp the nature of form-analytical inquiry, but also their sheer resentment toward it. Christoph Butterwege's contribution from 1977 serves as a case in point. In it, Butterwege speaks of the, quote, petty bourgeois character of the student movement, a character he claims persists in the, quote, aberrations, quote, logical shadowboxing, and, quote, artificially inflated levels of abstraction, and, quote, found within the state theoretical debates of Neo-Marxism, and which ultimately exposes the anti-communist, quote, predisposition of most of the participants, end quote. The central failing of these attempts at theoretical derivation, it is argued, lies in their, quote, remoteness from the base, end quote, of the labor movement, a detachment that manifests itself theoretically in, quote, elitist tendencies, in, quote, seminar Marxist, Talmudic, and political alchemical, end quote, quote, conceptual acrobatics, end quote, in conceptual l'art pour l'art, in, quote, incestuous citation cartels, and ultimately in a, quote, vicious circle of pseudo-Marxist, quote, derivation mysticism, end quote. Politically, this detachment is said to, quote, foster an illusory exaggeration of the revolutionary perspective, end quote. Moreover, the orientation towards circulation as the starting point for a formal theory of the political is criticized for ignoring the, quote, question of property, end quote. Since, quote, practical relevance for the historical struggle of the labor movement constitutes the decisive criterion of validation and evaluation, end quote, for Marxist theory building, one must ultimately conclude that the contributions of authors ranging from Müller and Neuss to Blanca and Hirsch are, quote, not worth the paper, end quote, on which they are written. Such anti-intellectualist party-mandated thinking was, in DKP circles, regarded as a contribution to, quote, scientific socialism. Let us now, however, leave this unpleasant terrain, which still awaits a proper socio-psychological analysis, and turn our attention to various characteristic points of criticism and extensions regarding the positions outlined thus far. Okay, Section 1. A historical materialism without history? First heading, quote, ahistoricity. In the course of the debate, two variants of the charge, that of a neglect of history, or alternatively a logicist reduction of state theory, can be identified. While the first operates partly within the framework of the, quote, New Marx reading, the second, which is to be exemplified here by the case of Ernest Mandel, can be regarded as external to that paradigm. 1. First, however, let us turn to the intra-paradigmatic critique. Both Hanno Hochberger, 1974, and Heide Gerstenberger, 1973-1975, accused the state derivation debate to date of holding a, quote, latent ahistorical conception of the Marxian concept of the state, end quote. Quote, history does not take place in this form of historical materialism, end quote. According to Gerstenberger, a materialist theory of the state must, by contrast, take into account that not all essential characteristics of the bourgeois state can be determined through a form analytic derivation from the economic conditions of bourgeois society. Against the primacy of a logically systematic analysis of the state, derived, quote, from the structures of the developed capital relation, end quote. However, this may be conceived. It must be maintained that the bourgeois state constitutes not merely a result, but also an essential precondition of the capitalist mode of production. In this context, Gerstenberger and Hochberger distinguish between the material functions of the state, specifically its administrative apparatus, and its function as a state based on the rule of law, or rather the latent, quote, juridico-political form of intercourse, end quote, underlying it. But now criticize the, quote, common conflation of the formal and the material constitution of the bourgeois state, end quote, within the new Marxist discourse. A conflation which, according to Hochberger, ultimately culminates in an explanation of the genesis of the state's form that takes the shape of a, quote, disguised social contract theory, end quote. The central argument of this critique is that the state's administrative apparatus of coercion emerges historically prior to its form as a state based on the rule of law, and in doing so already provides economic functions of a, quote, primitive accumulative nature, or more precisely functions, quote, for the mercantile form of accumulation, end quote. From this thesis, Hochberger now derives two critiques of the logically systematic theory of the state. First, Hochberger argues that amidst the justified lamentation against the instrumentalist concept of the state associated with, quote, revisionism, though insight has been lost that the class character of the bourgeois state is already established through its function as an unmediated, quote, economic force in the formation of the material preconditions for the capitalist mode of production, specifically the concentration of money and means of production in the hands of a few, and the expropriation of direct producers from their means of production through the direct exercise of force or fiscal imposition. Gerstenberger, too, identifies the immediate and undisguised class character of the state and its capacity as an, quote, instrument for primitive accumulation. During its formative phase, the bourgeois state allegedly distinguished itself from pre-bourgeois apparatuses of rule, not yet in terms of its form, the exercise of direct coercive power within the process of material reproduction, but merely, quote, in terms of its functions, end quote. The instrumentalist theory of the state, therefore, possesses historical validity as a description of the organization of force during the epoch in which capitalist relations of production emerge. Furthermore, the process of state genesis and its historical primacy placed on the formation of the, quote, material state apparatus accords a primacy to historically concrete functional analysis over formal analysis of the bourgeois state. However, in response to Hochberger, Gerstenberger cautions that, on this basis, the class character of the state is merely, quote, historically substantiated, end quote, but not yet demonstrated as a structural necessity for developed capitalism. Indeed, one could plausibly argue that the state functions as a class state only when acting as a manifest institution of force, shaping material reproduction through forced labor for the lower classes and the granting of privileges to the economically dominant, but ceases to be one when operating within the forms of a constitutional state. This explanation must, indeed, proceed from the contemporary history of the capital relation and simultaneously answer the question of why the state in the bourgeois era changes its form, and as a constitutional state exercises dominion over the entire society. However accurate this observation may be, the concepts Gerstenberger employs, through which he purports to grasp the abstract general form of the state, strike one as unsatisfactory. At one moment, the problem of form is reduced to the question of legitimation. At another, there is explicit talk of the semblance of the universality of the norm. This curtailment of the concept of form, limiting it to processes of ideological legitimation, fails to do justice to the reality of constitutional principles. A reduction, moreover, that is, as has been shown, quite prevalent within the current debate. Hochberger's second critique concerns the character of these attempts at derivation as disguised social contract theories. These are allegedly characterized by the claim to derive the administrative apparatus, the state as a bureaucratic centralized coercive power, from the juridico-political form of intercourse, the relations of private autonomous general will among commodity owners, rather than first conceiving it as an originally accumulative function of the system's core structure. However, Hochberger's ambition to unmask all previous attempts at derivation as such contract theories remains unfulfilled. He confines himself to a critique of the indeed unclear position taken by the PKA in 1973. Here, the relations of recognition among commodity owners as private proprietors are, on the one hand, intentionally reduced to a conscious expression of the exchange relation, and on the other, the guarantee of actual legal relations is explained as arising from the actions of the united exchange subjects, whereby the process of state genesis is objectively reduced to a citizen's initiative. In contrast, Marx employs a two-stage analysis of the constitution of the differentiation of the juridico-political form of intercourse. First, the legal form is conceived as a structural effect of the exchange relation, within which the actors, tacitly recognize one another as free and equal private proprietors, doing so in the guise of a factual relation springing up through and within the exchange itself. Hochberger now points out that this factual relation of will is not endowed with the attribute of being a conscious expression of the exchange relation, but rather with the category of the tacit, a fact which, he argues, demonstrates that what is at issue here is the discussion of objective movements which are, as it were, unconsciously executed by individuals. Here, however, one might also ask what quasi-unconsciously is meant to signify. One may speculate that unconsciousness is at work here in several respects. First is ignorance regarding the basis of the social exchange relation among commodity owners, the value form. Second, as ignorance regarding the determination of their volitional relations by the commodity form, and finally, as an implicit recognition that need not be openly articulated. This latter aspect would constitute something akin to a pre-conscious volitional relation. One more that is not unfamiliar even to contract empiricist variants of contractualism. Regrettably, Hochberger does not delve further into these questions. Instead, he focuses on the second dimension of the genesis of the legal form, the actual constitution or consolidation of the sphere of law, hitherto merely a latently distinct subsphere, which he argues proceeds via a general reference on the part of the exchangers, to the already existing administrative apparatus, It is through this process, he contends, that the juridical form, or more precisely, the real contractual form, is first derived. The form, quote, in which these economic transactions appear as volitional acts of the participants, as expressions of their collective will, and as contracts enforceable by the state against any individual party, end quote. Yet, he notes, this form does not itself create its content, namely the exchange relation of commodities and the factual relationship among the actors involved, but serves merely as its expression, a fact that necessitates the formal analytical starting point in the sphere of circulation. Thus, the quote, structure of expectations regarding a future positive law, end quote, that emerges from commodity exchange is brought forth as a distinct constitutional legal form only through its reference to a historically already constituted institution of coercion, an institution that simultaneously generates the conditions for the universalization of commodity exchange. Does then the quote, divergence between the material and formal constitution of the bourgeois state, end quote, also carry significance that serves to delimit the scope of its logical systematic derivation? It's something more being criticized here than merely the confusion, already cautioned against by the Marxist group, between the logical and the empirical presupposition of the bourgeois state, given that even Hochberger concedes that the fragmentary determination of the state in Marx's Capital, quote, proceeds in reverse, and necessarily must proceed in reverse, end quote. That is, that it grasps what is historically presupposed as a conceptual result. Or is Hochberger conflating the inquiries of a logically systematic theory of the state with those of a historically empirical theory of constitution, insofar as, in his account, the question regarding the original emergence of specific state functions is made to substitute for the question regarding the causes of the continuous reproduction of these mechanisms upon the very foundations of bourgeois society. Thus, Norbert Kostede can rightly point out that the sole net worth aspect of these interventions is merely the already familiar fact, quote, that the conceptual sequence of society and state within the course of derivation must be misunderstood neither as a historical nor as an empirical sequence, end quote. Regardless of this, however, according to Kostede, the designation of the bureaucratic centralized coercive power of the quote, mercantile era as a bourgeois state is open to criticism. Consequently, the entire theoretical construct advanced by Gerstenberger and Hochberger, positing a bourgeois state constituted first in a material administrative sense and only later historically in a formal legal sense, is rendered untenable. Kostede demonstrates how the quote, bourgeois state, which supposedly existed in a quote, formless manner prior to bourgeois society, actually represents an absolutist transitional form. This form stems from a quote, original, albeit not yet complete, diremption, separation of social spheres, and is subsequently quote, transformed into the bourgeois state proper in the course of the development of the capitalist mode of production, that is, during the bourgeois revolution. According to Kostede, the concept of quote, original diremption encompasses neither the emergence of class rule, the quote, separation of classes in a general sense, nor the partial differentiation of apparatuses and personnel of rule, observable even in pre-capitalist modes of production, that might otherwise permit the concept of the quote, state to be projected onto ancient or feudal epochs. Rather, it denotes a process novel in comparison to all preceding social formations, involving the separation of rule from appropriation during the quote, transition from feudalism to modernity, end quote. In this context, one observes a centralization of military force, the formation of large-scale states transcending fragmented structures of rule, a bureaucratization of the exercise of power, the absorption of the corporate functions of urban citizenry, and the emergence of a new system of taxation. Despite these processes involving the dissolution of fragmented feudal powers and the emergence of specific forms of centralized state-based rule characterized by a monopoly on violence absolutism, in its own specific way, nonetheless retained pre-modern characteristics of political organization. The unity of rule and appropriation was neither abolished, nor was the guarantee of privileged appropriation, which continued to be mediated through personal, albeit now monarchically centralized proprietary rights to rule. As a, quote, product of the two types of rule, unquote, absolutist statehood may therefore be characterized as a, quote, transitional form, end quote. It was only within the context of the bourgeois revolution that the separation, or rather the constitution, of politics and economics became a reality. Quote, in our context, quote, original diremption signifies not a definitive realization, but rather a tendential realization and differentiation of, quote, civil society and the, quote, political state, end quote, unquote. This process of diremption is termed, quote, original, because it cannot be adequately, quote, explained solely by reference to the internal structure of the early bourgeois, urban, or guild-based civic sphere, end quote. Ultimately, partially differentiated absolutist statehood assumes central functions within the process of original accumulation, yet it cannot be regarded as an instrument for the deliberate creation of the social conditions necessary for industrial capitalism. Consequently, its characterization as an overt class instrument of the bourgeoisie must be called into question. Heide-Gerstenberger, too, abandons the misleading designation of the absolutist state as a transitional form, doing so in her later comprehensive theory of the emergence of bourgeois state power, published in 1990, in favor of introducing a specific transitional category, the Ancien regime. This social formation, she argues, differs from both feudalism and bourgeois society. In feudalism, authority is inherent in persons and is directed towards persons as members of kinship groups. Such personal rule constitutes a form of domination grounded in immediate power relations. Consequently, no distinct institution or sphere of rule exists apart from the socially integrative mechanisms of power-backed interactions. Sacred symbolic power, with the church acting as the institution administering the legitimation of rule, and law are, in this context, merely functions of a power-backed domination exercised by persons over persons. Here, appropriation is an integral component of rule itself. There exists no distinct sphere of the, quote, economy separate from the actual practice of rule. Thus, this unified nexus of social action cannot be conceptualized as a mere, quote, combination of economy and politics, end quote. Moreover, the system of manorialism, parenthesis, Grundherrschaft / Gutsherrschaft, in parenthesis, is characterized by a far-reaching fragmentation or autonomization of sovereignties, manifesting as partial personal domains of rule that do not yet form part of any systematic society-wide framework. The immediate agrarian producers, peasants including hereditary serfs, etc., cultivate the land with relative autonomy. Their surplus product is appropriated by force in the form of labor rents, rents in kind, and monetary rents. Aristocratic rule is grounded in manorialism, with its specific modes of appropriation comprising the exercise of armed force and judicial authority, warfare, plunder, strategic marriage alliances, and privileged trade. In contrast, the structures of the social formation of the Ancien regime are characterized by the generalization of personal rule and appropriation. Aristocratic rule becomes a, quote, privilege in relation to generalized princely power, end quote. Appropriation, too, is now grounded in altered foundations. Unlike forms mediated directly by force, feudalism, or by the market, capitalism, it may be termed privileged appropriation. Rule and appropriation evolve into legal titles, guaranteed and conferred by the territorial prince, meaning they are embedded within generalized legal structures. While the rule and appropriation largely retain their personal character, they are simultaneously centralized, generalized, and territorialized. Quote, society thus emerges as a, quote, structural reality, as a concrete historical totality. The transition from the Ancien regime, quote, to modern capitalist society is not possible arbitrarily. It succeeds in those regions where, building upon the feudal system, monetarily mediated relationships emerged at an early stage through autonomous units of production and urban trade, and where, on this very basis, the fiscalization of relations of rule and appropriation was fostered or enforced by territorial princes. This in turn compelled the newly liberated individuals to develop or accept new forms of social organization, whether in the sphere of the market or of politics. The dissolution of traditional forms was most readily achieved in those places where urban culture, in conjunction with rural production or overseas markets, was able to establish itself as the dominant culture, thereby creating the preconditions for the future development of capitalism, and doing so in a manner that was not merely economic. However, in Gerstenberger's work, there is no longer any mention of a, quote, bourgeois state with regard to the, quote, political power of the Ancien regime. Rather, the genesis of the bourgeois state presupposes the process of the bourgeois revolution. Consequently, the process and, quote, structural category of the bourgeois revolution, and, quote, does not posit any specific form of historical change. It does not imply the notion of an economic developmental logic that necessarily entails the revolutionary overthrow of the Ancien regime, nor does it state anything, quote, regarding the specific social groups involved in the conflicts through which personal rule is regulated, restricted, and ultimately eliminated, end quote. Instead, its, quote, central conceptual content, end quote, lies in the assertion that the transition to bourgeois society necessitates the expropriation of personal proprietary rights to rule, and by extension the abolition of the dominating character inherent in the appropriation of the social surplus product. Thus, rule is reduced to the sphere of politics, understood as a sphere grounded in the state's monopoly or legitimate physical force, while appropriation is reduced solely to relations mediated through reified commodity money exchanges. Quote, this, nothing more, but also nothing less, is what the analytical concept of the separation of politics and economics asserts. This conceptual framework offers no statement regarding the actual content of politics, and in particular nothing regarding the extent of state regulation of economic processes. End quote. In a second. Hold on. 2. A critique of the neglect of historical analysis, originating from outside the prevailing paradigm, can be found in the contributions of Ernest Mandel, a prominent proponent of the historicist interpretation of Marx's analysis of forms. Mandel asserts, analogous to his advocacy of a, quote, logical historical, unquote, method in the analysis of the value form, that, quote, any attempt to determine the class character of the bourgeois state while simultaneously abstracting from the historical origins of the state, i.e., while excluding the genetic method, must inevitably come into conflict with historical materialism, end quote. Mandel argues that all attempts at systematic derivation overlook the fact that, quote, the bourgeoisie did not itself create the state, that is, the state machinery detached from society as an autonomous institution, but rather inherited the state from absolutism and merely reshaped it in accordance with its own interests, end quote. Mandel thus extends his historicist understanding of Marx's, quote, critical genetic method, end quote, from the critique of political economy into the realm of state theory. He fails to recognize the fundamental distinction between the dynamics of origin, the quote becoming, and the dynamics of immanent reproduction, the quote being of modern diremption, a distinction that has already been elucidated on several occasions. Mandel views the fact that the bourgeois state emerged from a non-bourgeois society not merely as an argument against a logico-systematic theory of the state, as if a systematic derivation necessarily presupposed an absolute system that originally generates its own preconditions ex nihilo, but also contends that any derivation proceeding from the simple or developed, quote, surface of capital constitutes an attempt to portray the state as emerging, quote, solely from economic relations, end quote. Consequently, it appears that Mandel has failed to adequately reflect upon the distinction between the empirical presupposition of political forms and their character as results within the context of theoretical exposition. Mandel's further thesis, quote, that every contemporary bourgeois state simultaneously exhibits the general characteristics of this state formation, while combining them with specific features that depend closely on the particular moment and the specific conditions of class struggle under which the bourgeoisie fought for the direct seizure of political power, end quote, is by contrast entirely plausible. However, the fact that the concrete historical manifestations and conditions of development of a given social formation cannot be derived solely from its general formal determinations is a point sufficiently familiar within the, quote, derivation debate, even if, as we shall see, is not always consistently applied in specific instances. The specific conditions of constitution, whether national or regional, peculiar to each individual bourgeois state, fundamentally shape both its subsequent development and its concrete historical structure. These arguments do not, of course, lend support to the kind of historicist contamination of formal analysis that Mandel appears to advocate. To counter this conceptual confusion, the following key points must be emphasized. Just as applies to the dialectical exposition of the forms of wealth, it holds equally true for the conceptual development of bourgeois law and the bourgeois state in general that A, it constitutes a structural analysis of simultaneously existing phenomena. B, its abstractions prescind from all historically specific forms of the bourgeois state in order to isolate, quote, that which generally characterizes the bourgeois state or bourgeois law, end quote. Whereby C, this process of abstraction is not extended beyond the determination specific to the particular social formation, so as to construct a universal historical, quote, theory of the political, end quote. And D, the logically systematic determinations of bourgeois law and the bourgeois state constitute the necessary precondition for their historical analysis. However, Mandel's methodological historicism also yields consequences for the theory of the object. By rejecting questions of formal analysis, Mandel opens his approach to an agent-theoretical conceptualization of the class character of the bourgeois state, one that advances not a single step beyond Lenin's The State and Revolution. For Mandel, the modern state serves as a, quote, direct instrument of the economically dominant class, both in the class struggle and in the management of crises. This claim is purportedly substantiated by, among other things, empirical evidence regarding the personnel interlock between the bourgeoisie and the state, the class origins of political personnel, and the structural obstruction of democratic participation by the working class at the hands of the executive branch. In this context, Mandel advances a phase theory analogous to state monopoly capitalism approach, in which the autonomous form of political class rule is confined to the, quote, pre-imperialist state of, quote, competitive capitalism, unquote. It was only in that context, Mandel argues, that, quote, the bourgeoisie was largely able to forego the direct exercise of state power, end quote. Handel. New heading, quote, theoreticism and empiricism, end quote. Joachim Hirsch criticizes the debate on derivation for its lack of mediating categories that could put an end to the, quote, conjunction of highly abstract determinations of essence with flat empiricism, end quote. While he does not reject form analysis per se, his own remarks regarding a conceptual derivation of the form of the state remain rather rhapsodic. Criticism is always directed primarily at Hirsch's attempt at derivation through mere analogical reasoning, as well as his tautological definition of the form of extra-economic coercive power, defined solely by its differentiation from bourgeois society. However, Gertrudel rightly observes that Hirsch, even more so than Outvater, is evidently less concerned with presenting a rigorous categorical derivation than with, quote, developing a categorical foundation for the empirical analysis of state functions and their historic evolution, end quote. Thus, in 1976, he undertook one of the first attempts to integrate the form analytical grounding of state theory with an analysis of the systemic selectivity of the parliamentary and administrative apparatus, as well as with the relational state theory of Gramsci, Poulantzas, and Althusser. Since the aim of the present work is not to outline a comprehensive, empirically substantive Marxist state theory, but rather to address the question of the character and viability of the methodological approach of a logical systematic form analysis within the context of legal and state theory, Hirsch's approach is considered here solely because it demonstrates that such attempts at synthesis can be conceptualized on the basis of, rather than, as in later works of the Neo-Gramscian school, exclusively in opposition to, the form analytical approach. According to Hirsch, the, quote, concentration on abstract categorical problems of, quote, form derivation, unquote, within the West German discourse of the early 1970s stems from the specifically German situation of the, quote, largely successful ideological integration of the proletariat, unquote. Consequently, more concrete strategic or even tactical questions of class struggle scarcely featured on the theoretical agenda of this critique of politics discourse, thereby hindering the development of a more comprehensive paradigm of state theory. However, Hirsch initially takes a stand against the emerging tendency toward an abstract negation of form analysis. The common accusation regarding its ahistorical character, he argues, simply misses its objective inquiry, and thus ignores the fact that, quote, the problem of the historical emergence of bourgeois class rule must not be conflated with that of its mode of reproduction, unquote. On the economic level, the object of form analysis is not the initial genesis of class structure, but rather the mechanism through which these conditions reproduce themselves within capitalism, on capitalism's own foundations. Similarly, on the political level, form analysis cannot be legitimately challenged by citing the historical emergence of a central authority, one that could by no means yet be characterized as bourgeois, but its true objective inquiry is the, quote, mode in which political rule reproduces itself within a bourgeois society once that society is fully developed, unquote. Thus, even Gramsci's definition of the state as, quote, hegemony armored with coercion, unquote, comes under criticism. Hirsch argues that violent repression and ideological integration constitute criteria for the organization of rule that are not specific to any particular social formation, and that this definition reflects neither the determinants of the historical balance of class forces, nor, quote, the form that this content must necessarily assume under the conditions of the capitalist mode of production, unquote. Nevertheless, a recourse to the relational state theory of the Gramscian school is deemed advisable, as a purely categorical derivation cannot proceed beyond identifying the fundamental class character of the bourgeois state, thereby leaving most questions pertinent to concrete political analysis unanswered. The objective of such analysis must therefore be to answer 1. How class movements translate into political practice, simultaneously transforming and sustaining themselves within the latter specifically non-economic mode of reproduction, and consequently how the class character of the state is reproduced at the level of concrete political action, and 2. How specifically within the state apparatus the collective class interest of capital asserts itself against, and simultaneously in opposition to, the interest of individual capitals and the proletariat. Hirsch is thus concerned with what, in neo-Gramscian discourse, is termed the specific, relatively autonomous grammar of the political field. The class character of the state can be concretized first and foremost by defining it as a material condensation of class relations. In doing so, Hirsch draws upon the ideas of Nikos Palantzas, according to whom the state cannot be conceived exclusively as a violent, organized, immediate reflection of class relations, one that could, as it were, be pressed into the service of one side of the class antagonism from, quote, the outside. No direct access by a particular interest to state functions is possible. Rather, these functions retain a relative autonomy vis-a-vis class struggles, even while being thoroughly permeated by them. The state is comprehensible only as a material condensation of a social balance of forces and as a contradictory complex of sub-apparatuses, the very heterogeneity of which generates effects functional to domination. State policy thus establishes itself as the resultant of the balance of forces inscribed within the institutional structure of the state. The, quote, materiality of the state apparatus is induced by the reproduction of capitalist relations of production through the class actions of various actors, while state power itself takes shape within the repressive ideological and mass integrative apparatuses as the resultant of conflicting forces, as a precarious, quote, compromise structure with a dominant element, quote. As such, it is relatively autonomous not only vis-a-vis the interests of the dominant fraction of the ruling power block, but also vis-a-vis the internally hierarchized consensus of the power block itself, since the latter must always also establish a, quote, compromise equilibrium, quote, with the subaltern classes. That is, it must incorporate symbolic and material aspects of their interest into the framework of domination. The state apparatus thus functions simultaneously as the object of social struggles and as a terrain endowed with its own distinct logic. In distinguishing internally between state apparatuses, categorizing them as either repressive or ideological mass integrative, Hirsch draws upon Gramsci's concept of the, quote, integral state, conceived as a unity of coercion in civil society, as well as Althusser's reflections regarding the structure of the, quote, ideological state apparatuses, quote. However, Hirsch tacitly modifies their positions regarding the theory of ideology. While he emphasizes, in agreement with Althusser, that ideologies are, quote, rooted in constitutive practices, quote, he points, in contrast to Althusser, to the objective thought forms of the capitalist circulation process, the fetishizations and mystifications of freedom, equality, and property, as their source. Consequently, ideological apparatuses do not generate ideologies. Rather, they merely systematize, process, and generalize them. From a contemporary perspective, this position may appear reductionist, for why should practices other than economic ones not also generate specific mystifications with relative autonomy? Yet the emphasis on the spontaneous genesis of inverted notions within everyday capitalist practice, and on the form determination of these notions, must be upheld as a central insight of form analysis, standing in contrast to the positions of Gramsci and Althusser, which ultimately remain indifferent to such questions. What we shall not pursue further here, how Hirsch defines repressive, ideological, and mass integrative apparatuses, nor how he elucidates their modes of operation by means of a theory of class-specific selectivity in the consideration of interests. Suffice it to point out that through Hirsch's concretizations, the state apparatus comes into view as a contradictory mode, endowed with its own internal logic, for processing social power relations. In doing so, it takes steps towards an intermediate theoretical field, a level that in Hirsch's own work would not find its provisional point of consolidation until the 1980s, with his reception of positions derived from regulation theory. Despite the need for mutual correction or expansion, incorporating the form determination of social practice in one instance, and concrete power relations along with their political codification in another, attempts such as Hirsch's demonstrate that, quote, the two major initiatives for a renewal of Marxism as political theory, initiatives that shaped the 1960s and 1970s, need by no means be mutually exclusive. Okay. Section 2. On, quote, economisms and, quote, circulationisms. First heading, economism, objectivism, and structuralism. The charge of, quote, economism is not only one of the most widespread topoi in general within intra-Marxist discourse, it also constitutes a central point of both intra- and extra-paradigmatic criticism of the theory of the derivation of the state. In this context, quote, economism is to be understood as encompassing a whole range of phenomena that extend far beyond the conventional usage of the term, which typically denotes a strict substantive determination of the political sphere by the economic. Various variants of this concept will now be presented and examined for their plausibility. While Michael Jäger by no means fundamentally questions the utility of a, quote, state derivation, he identifies two limitations inherent into it that render it, quote, highly unsuitable, end quote, for the analysis of concrete political conditions and strategic questions facing the left: the theoretical restriction to utilizing only the categories found in Marx's Capital. Jäger argues the theoretical restriction to utilizing only the categories found in Marx's Capital, Jäger argues, creates a practical strategic void, specifically a lack of concrete conceptualizations for socialist politics and for how to engage concretely with the bourgeois state in the pursuit of emancipation. A theory of politics that remains confined to the economic abstractions of Marx's Capital is, in his view, economistic. It effectively cedes the analysis of concrete politics to empiricism. His line of argument, directed specifically against Baader, thus primarily condemns the conflation of political structural analysis with an economically grounded structural analysis, a conflation that relegates any explanatory framework for political structures and processes not derived from the general categories of Marx's Capital to the realm of historical empirical analysis, thereby attributing a purely contingent character to such phenomena. This mode of critique is already evident in Louis Althusser's engagement with Engels' anti-economistic interventions from the 1890s. Despite emphasizing the relative autonomy of the superstructure, premised on the notion that economic determination asserts itself only, quote, in the last instance, end quote, Engels, in Althusser's view, conceives of the superstructure merely as an accumulation of contingencies, or as the, quote, source of a microscopic multitude of events, whose internal connecting thread remains unintelligible and therefore irrelevant, end quote. While the writings of Marx and Engels may indeed constitute a, quote, inexhaustible reservoir of concrete, quote, empirical records, end quote, unquote, they have, according to this structure, failed to produce a, quote, theory of the specific efficacy of the superstructure, end quote. Unlike Althusser, Jäger is indeed aware of the possibility of a formal analysis of the state, one that represents the exact opposite of a historically descriptive approach to political theory utilizing Marxian categories. Yet even this approach, he argues, has failed to render the concrete level of the political amenable to theoretical analysis. Consequently, drawing upon Gramsci's conceptions of the party and hegemony, Foucault's microphysics of power, and Palantis's relational view of the state, a, quote, theory of the logic of capitalist power, end quote, must be developed. Such a theory would be capable of addressing an autonomous non-economic basis for political relations, namely class relations that are, quote, overdetermined by civil society. As previously demonstrated, Joachim Hirsch has already formulated such a program in the mid-1970s. Indeed, Jäger characterizes Hirsch's approach as the, quote, greatest advance in the debate, end quote. However, he argues that this approach, in turn, harbors yet another economistic tendency, specifically the premise of an empirical distinction between base and superstructure, a distinction wherein the nexus of their mediation is addressed only retrospectively. Accordingly, in Hirsch's framework, an apolitical class analysis, when merely added to a classless analysis of politics, is expected to yield a class theoretical determination of the relationship between economy and politics. Thus, the very question of how classes concretely work themselves into political domination is dismissed as economistic on the grounds that it posits the premise of class subjects determined solely by economic factors. A consequence of this attempt at conceptualization, one that is by no means secondary, is the narrowing of the concept of the, quote, party to that of a mere subsector within the apparatus of mass integration, alongside the characterization of, quote, people's parties, or integrative parties, as formations requiring explanation, formations supposedly evolved from purely class-based parties. In contrast, following Gramsci, one must proceed from the empirical unity of base and superstructure. Furthermore, the reproduction of class domination within the political field by parties must be understood as the formation of class alliances that are already prefigured by hegemony. Just as the economic circumstances of actors, qua class individuals, are never perceived in a pure state devoid of political interpretive frameworks, neither do, quote, pure class forces exist that require integration only ex post facto. Rather, the class alliance, in which the quote, economically subordinate find themselves allied with the bourgeoisie, end quote, constitute the primordial form through which political class interests are articulated. While Jäger's objections to limiting the theoretical analyzability of an object to the level of economic structural concepts are understandable, his emphasis on the empirical complexity of the concrete reproduction of class rule under capitalism is likewise difficult to dismiss. However, the question arises as to whether, in his critique of Hirsch, he does not go too far. For on the one hand, since he presupposes a formal analysis of the state, Hirsch has already elaborated an internal matrix of conditions linking class relations and the rule of law. Thus, for the purpose of his intermediate theoretical work, he by no means proceeds from a classless, empty form of the state. On the other hand, Hirsch clearly points to the analytical character of his differentiations among state apparatuses. Fundamentally, however, one must ask how an explanation of the nexus between politics and economics could possibly dispense with their prior analytical differentiation. The fact that a phenomenon is empirically complex can hardly be marshaled as an argument against its analytical decomposition and subsequent synthetic, i.e. conceptually reconstructed, recomposition. While commencing with the empirically complex is by no means inherently hostile to theory, it risks lapsing into a descriptivism that rejects any hierarchy of categories and levels of abstraction as reductionist, thereby rendering explanation per se impossible, a point that could be substantiated not least by examining the many tautological, quote, explanatory approaches found within the field of discourse analysis. Yet Jäger, too, must proceed from such analytical differentiations, a necessity demonstrated not least by his category of the, quote, class individual, which he argues must be further specified as the, quote, party individual, end quote. That is, the class individual is shaped by hegemonic class alliances. Were one to consistently maintain that such a procedure is illegitimate, Jaeger's own approach would have to be criticized as contradictory, for he too continues to presuppose the concept of, quote, class interest, a concept which, strictly speaking, would itself be, quote, economistic, end quote. After all, the separation of the spheres of economics and politics is not an economistic reification, but a real principle of socialization under capitalism. Nor is this in turn arbitrarily open to political redefinition. While in the late 1970s, Jaeger was still able to appreciate the, quote, state derivation approach, at least partially, by 1994 it appeared to him merely as a, quote, mirror stage of state theory, end quote, held captive by the spell of Hegelian anamnesis. In this view, derivation is interpreted as an idealist research method, claiming to transition from one, quote, concept to another without additional empirical study, a process allegedly leading to nothing more than the projection of economic structures familiar from Marx's Capital onto the political sphere. While this conflation of conceptual presentation with an a priori method of research may indeed occur in some instances, Jaeger, without scrutiny or a single piece of supporting evidence, imputes this very quid pro quo to the entire debate. In doing so, he employs the same argumentative stratagem previously utilized by W.F. Haug in his critique of monetary value theory, the identification of conceptual presentation with Hegelianism. Jaeger claims that Marx, in the course of his engagement with Adolf Wagner's derivation of use value and exchange value from the concept of value, effectively, quote, pokes fun at the very term derivation as such, end quote. Jaeger then exploits the mere verbal identity of the term derivation as it appears in the context of Wagner's philosophy of identity versus the context of formal analysis within the state derivation debate to suggest a conceptual equivalence between the two. This leads him back to the aforementioned, quote, projection thesis, end quote. Ultimately, the category of derivation is even conflated with Ricardo's method of subsuming concrete data under general laws without any mediating links. Thus, the alleged abstractness of the state derivation approach is at one moment equated with a, quote, idealist generative method of conceptual linkage, and at another with the flawed method of abstraction characteristic of classical political economy. In the process, the true objective of conceptual development, whether one chooses to label it derivation or dialectical presentation, is completely lost from sight. 2. Dimitri Demoulas and Yanis Milios point to a critique which they consider, quote, hardly convincing, leveled against attempts to derive legal political phenomena from economic ones. In Marx dans ses limites, Althusser allegedly claims that Marx's attempt to derive law from exchange relations is, quote, operatic because without state-guaranteed currency and without state apparatuses to register transactions and arbitrate disputes, no functioning market is conceivable, end quote. Such an accusation of, quote, economism, they argue, fails to recognize the radical distinction between a form analysis of law and an empiricist examination of the genesis of law. The derivation of the legal form from the commodity form empirically presupposes the existence of developed class relations as well as the entire superstructure. It therefore lays claim to, quote, no historical genetic derivation, end quote, of these elements. Thus, it does not posit the thesis of an economic base that, within the context of the, quote, ideological political vacuum, end quote, spontaneously generates all legal and state forms ex nihilo. Rather, it merely grants the economy, and specifically the commodity form, quote, a logical functional primacy, end quote. aiming to demonstrate that the conceptually isolated fundamental principle of commodity-based socialization, quote, requires a system of norms that articulates specific premises and enforces them coercively, end quote. According to this view, Pashukanis demonstrates that a system of universal exchange, which inherently presupposes class relations, requires specifically legal political forms of social interaction in order to reproduce itself. Here, the authors evidently posit a type of functional relationship between exchange and law, one that is purportedly uncovered within the framework of form analytical reconstruction efforts. It remains an open question to what extent such a conception can be clearly distinguished from functionalist fallacies, i.e., explaining a cause by reference to its effect. Does law, then, exist simply because it is necessary for the reproduction of the exchange nexus? Or is the explanation of its existence, the quote, why question, subordinate to the demonstration of its necessity? To the best of my knowledge, these questions have scarcely been addressed in any depth within the Marxist debates of the Federal Republic. Drawing upon the work of the British analytical Marxist G.A. Cohen, Jürgen Ritzert outlines a proposal to employ functional arguments as a logically sound type of explanation, specifically in the context of explaining self-reproducing patterns of action. The existence of latent functions, that is, the unintended effects that give a given process as upon a particular state of affairs, can, he suggests, be elucidated within the framework of a, quote, consequence explanation, unquote. The structure of such an explanation is as follows. If event E, e.g. a dance performed by a tribal members intended as a rain dance, a manifest function occurs at time 1, then effect F, the stabilization of tribal cohesion, a latent function, follows at time 2, and consequently, event E, the rain dance itself, occurs at time 3. In this scheme, the cause E, the rain dance itself, is not explained by its effect, a move which Ritzert too recognizes as a violation of the asymmetry postulate governing causal explanations, but rather the cause occurs, quote, by virtue of its disposition to bring about this specific effect, unquote. This approach would allow for explanations of the following type, quote, therefore, if the relations of production foster the development of the productive forces, they persist because they foster the development of the productive forces, unquote. Yet even Ritzert characterizes such statements as, quote, unfamiliar, unusual, and somewhat tautological, unquote. Is the intended implication, then, that a pre-existing process E is reproduced because it is functional for or yields a beneficial effect for a particular state F? Does this discussion revolve around the distinction reflected upon by Horst Friedrich between the disappearing conditions of a system, quote, that which is found to exist but historically vanishes, end quote, and its reproduced conditions, quote, that which is found to exist but is reproduced because it constitutes a necessary component of the process of self-movement, end quote. Thomas Hausmann questions the validity of Cohen's category. The thesis that a cause can be explained by its, quote, disposition or, quote, tendency to bring about a specific effect can be understood in two ways. One, the tendency to produce an effect is conditioned by the effect itself. Or two, the tendency resides within the cause itself, such that the effect exerts no influence on its existence. In the first case, this constitutes a functionalist fallacy, or more precisely, an unacceptable teleological, quote, explanation. In the second case, it amounts to an ordinary causal explanation. However, according to Hausmann, functional explanations can also be merely vague formulations of dispositional causal explanations. In this context, individuals' actions are explained by reference to, quote, mental states, specifically their will. This is likely the type of explanation Anthony Giddens has in mind when he critically objects to functionalism, arguing that social requirements exist, quote, as causal factors implicit in social reproduction only insofar as they are recognized as such by those who are, at some point, affected by them and whose actions are influenced by them." Unquote. With regard to the Marxist explanation of law, however, the problem now arises as to how, in this specific context, unconscious phenomena can still be rationally explained in a, quote, functional manner. So I'm trying to find my spot. A prominent critique of the derivation approach originating from outside that paradigm, which characterizes it as per se economistic, can be found in the works of Nikos Palantzis. In his engagement with Pashukanis, he levels the charge that deriving the legal form from the commodity form amounts to denying law any relative autonomy, and constitutes an offshoot of the historicist problematic of the subject. Palantzis posits that the socio-legal perspective adopted by Pashukanis and Stuchka, through its specific mode of explanation, reduces law to the level of the economy. In doing so, however, law's character as an autonomous object is negated, and it is rendered identical with the underlying social base relation. One can no longer discern any relationship between base and superstructure in this framework, since one concept, the commodity form, absorbs the other, the legal form. To substantiate his thesis regarding the ultimately identity-philosophical construction of law, Palantzis points to Korsch's critique of Pashukanis. Korsch, Palantzis notes, had already recognized the, quote, consequences of this conception, unquote. The question now arises as to what Palantzis intends by his emphasis on the irreducibility of those elements, economy on the one hand and law/state on the other, that are to be dialectically interrelated. The assertion that, quote, the possibility of an independent theory rests upon the autonomy and independence of its object, unquote, and that a Marxist analysis of law is therefore only, quote, valid if it, quote, constitutes its own object, unquote, seems at first glance to signify nothing other than this, that a distinct empirical phenomenon, in this case law, must exist in order to be theoretically investigated. Yet the theory must conceptually reconstruct and explain this object rather than merely presupposing it conceptually. Any alternative interpretation of the terms, quote, independence of the object in its investigation, as employed by Palantzis in this context, would point toward the conceptual presupposition and lack of grounding and non-derivability of legal theoretical categories, as well as the unmediated nature or isolation of law as a subject of inquiry. Anyone who contrasts, quote, derivation and, quote, autonomy in this manner forfeits the opportunity to provide any explanation whatsoever of the subject matter. Regardless of whether one interprets the relationship between the commodity form and the legal form as a historical causal relation, a functional connection, or a relationship of causal coexistence, the thesis that legal phenomena are, quote, subsumed within economic ones must, following Hubert Rottleutner, be rejected as a, quote, widespread misconception, unquote. According to Rottleutner, the critique of, quote, economism, construed as a critique of reductionism, falls prey to the error of assuming that every explanation entails the complete dissolution of the explanandum into the antecedent clause of the explanatory hypothesis, explanans. Yet, were this the case, an explanation would lose its very meaning, for instance as an explanation positing the derivation of law from the economy actually presupposes above all else the ability, quote, to distinguish legal phenomena from other phenomena, unquote. As long as this occurs, quote, absolutely no reduction of law to economics, unquote, is to be feared. The notion of reduction stems either from an ignorance of the logical status of deductively nomological explanations, or from a literal interpretation of the, quote, expression metaphor found in statements such as the claim that law is an expression of production or exchange relations. As a consequence of this critique of reductionism, it is established that, quote, the idea that, quote, law is subsumed within, quote, economics would be tantamount to the assertion that the effect is subsumed within the cause, as if, to take the simplest example, the motion of a billiard ball were subsumed within the motion of the cue, end quote. It is only meaningful to speak of, quote, economism if one aims to provide a complete explanation of the legal system solely by means of economic variables. That this is not the claim being advanced in the attempt to derive the legal form from the commodity form requires no further elaboration here. However, Rottleutner's reflections regarding the source of the, quote, explanandum pulverization, end quote, argument found in the work of Paulinus and others can be further supplemented by noting that a rigid spatial conception of, quote, base and, quote, superstructure plays a central role in this context. Thus, Paulinus' key witness, Korsch, appears unable to conceive of law as a necessary implication of the exchange relations between commodity owners. What prevails here is simply the associative chain, commodity exchange equals economic base, not equal to law, for law is equated either with the finished, institutionalized form of coercive state legislation, or alternatively, with a rarefied legal ideology detached from, quote, material reality. A, quote, spatial distance is thus posited where, in reality, the issue concerns merely different perspectives on one and the same social relation, a relation that can be analytically distinguished into economic, a social relation between things, and legal, a social relation of wills between commodity owners, only for the purposes of analysis. As a Marxist, however, Paulinus cannot help but nonetheless establish a connection between economics and law, one, however, that attempts to completely bypass the phenomenon of the nexus of conditions linking the commodity form and the relations of will among commodity owners in exchange, given that this approach appears to him to be tainted by a philosophy of identity. Paulinus offers a more precise elaboration of his argument, one that moves beyond the mere repetition of structural Marxist commonplaces, which admittedly still sufficed for some interpreters in the 1990s to characterize Pashukanis' contribution as, quote, economistic, only in his theory of the state. Here he directly addresses the debate on the derivation of the state, subjecting its premises to sharp criticism. This approach, he argues, attempts to locate the foundation of the state, quote, within the sphere of capital circulation and in the, quote, generalization of commodity relations, end quote. Consequently, bourgeois society would there, quote, present itself as a contractually regulated association of individualized legal subjects, end quote. The separation of society and state is thereby, quote, reduced to an ideological mechanism immanent to commodity relations, to the fetishization and reification of the state, modeled upon the famous concept of commodity fetishism, end quote. This approach is ultimately pre-Marxist, he contends, because it derives the state from circulation rather than from the relations of production. Moreover, it renders impossible the connection between the, quote, pair, quote, state bourgeois society, end quote, and the pair, quote, state class struggle, end quote, since classes themselves have their foundations in the relations of production, end quote. Paulinus' critique, however, entails various misunderstandings. First, the real determinations of simple circulation are dissolved into mere ideological mechanisms and placed in unmediated opposition to the, quote, material base of the relations of production, a point to which the socialist study groups draw attention in their critique. Paulinus, they argue, espouses the, quote, vulgar Marxist thesis of a, quote, base, over which hovers the, quote, deceptive illusion of circulation, end quote. In doing so, he overlooks the fact that exchange-mediated appropriation, along with its specific determinations, constitutes a real principle of material reproduction under capitalism and is therefore, quote, itself an essential component of the relations of production, end quote. From this premise also stems Paulinus' thesis that taking the exchange relation as one starting point renders it impossible to incorporate the class character of the relations of production into political theory. Since he conceives of the relationship between circulation and production as purely external, or a dialectical, or to phrase it more cautiously, a theoretical transition from the one to the other, one that reflects their interconnection, is for him unthinkable. Whereas in his critique of Pashukanus, Palancis merely asserted the abstract general character of law, he now sets out to provide it with a materialist foundation. The specificity of modern law, or more precisely of modern legislation, lies, in his view, in the fact that it, quote, constitutes an axiomatized system, comprising an ensemble of norms that are abstract, general, formal, and strictly regulated, end quote. This specific character, too, cannot be grasped by taking circulation as one's starting point. Rather, it must be derived from the, quote, social division of labor, end quote. Law, he argues, forms the, quote, formal framework of cohesion, quote, for actors who have been, quote, liberated, both from feudal relations of direct dependency and from control over the means of production. In doing so, it functions as the, quote, organizer of unity and homogenization, end quote, for class distinctions that are already presupposed. Its abstract universal form, he argues, embodies the fragmentation of the social within the societal division of labor, and the individualization of human beings within the immediate labor process. For the space-time matrix of this process is specifically, quote, serial, cumulative, continuous, and homogeneous, end quote, and finds, quote, its clearest expression in the assembly line production. And finds, quote, its clearest expression in assembly line production, end quote. Both the law and the institutional structure of state apparatuses are thereby derived directly from the relations of production, specifically from the processes of the socialization of labor, the, quote, social division of labor, and the organizational effects of the valorization process in large-scale industry, the, quote, labor process and its space-time matrix, end quote. This explanatory model does not extend beyond a merely vague analogy between the empirical average-level determinations of the real subsumed labor process, ultimately Taylorist labor organization, and the legal form and organizational structure of state bureaucracies, between the determinations of the isolated private producer and those of the immediate labor process. The exchange process effectively falls through the cracks and is forgotten. Although the, quote, law of value is mentioned, value as a social form remains an unknown quantity in Palancis' conception, which recognizes only its preconditions, the liberated fragmented individual, and its material results, the emptied out, standardized, and leveled industrial labor process. The specific forms of economic and social mediation, value, the abstract principle of unity for dissociated products of labor, and law, the abstract principle of unity for dissociated wills, remain present in this legal theory only in a guise irrationally conflated with their own ideological effects. A commodity fetish and legal fetish. Finally, it is noteworthy that Palancis fails to make a conceptual distinction between law as a social form and statutory law as positive legislation. Consequently, he fails to achieve the very goal he himself articulated, to categorically grasp the relative autonomy of the law. In this context, Sonia Buckle aptly characterizes this approach as a, quote, methodological overestimation of the state, end quote. Ironically, however, and contrary to the views Palancis and his epigons, it is precisely Pashukanus who is able to provide a more adequate theoretical foundation for the autonomy of law, specifically in the guise of its abstract general form. For, as previously noted, deriving this form from another phenomenon does not entail its, quote, dissolution. Moreover, the abstract general form precludes any direct intrusion of particularistic ends, interest, or coercive measures into the legal sphere, a point highlighted by Buckle. Quote, only when the legal form exhibits relational autonomy, thereby rendering direct access by powerful social actors impossible, or at least significantly more difficult, can one truly speak of, quote, law within bourgeois capitalist societies, conceiving of law as a legal form, thus enables us to establish a connection with Paulinus' intuition regarding relative autonomy. Yet in doing so, Paulinus is also effectively corrected, specifically through recourse to the lines of reasoning advanced by Franz Neumann, who rejects the thesis that law is identical to a particularistic technique of power, and by Pashukanus, who posits that law, qua form, acquires its specific character only through its differentiation from, quote, repression theories, unquote, of law, theories that fundamentally misconstrue law as mere authoritative command. Paulinus' critique of the alleged economism of the state derivation approach thus ultimately reveals Paulinus' deficits in methodological and object theoretical terms, namely the derealization of the determinations of circulation, the absence of a form theory of labor and of the will, and the lack of a conceptual principle of development. One second. Four, authors such as Alex Demirovich and Thomas Sablovsky go as a step further than Paulinus. Their concern is no longer merely a critique of the failure to acknowledge the relative autonomy of the political. Rather, it is a critique of the, quote, economistic conception of the economy, and quote, itself. To avoid any equivocation regarding the concept of economism, let this be clarified. They advocate for conceptualizing all economic and political categories through the lens of action theory, and they condemn as, quote, objectivist even the very notion of a materiality of the state or the economy that might exist prior to social power relations. In doing so, Gramsci's concept of hegemony is radically transformed from a theory of distinct spheres into a constitutive theory of the social per se. Demirovich conceives of, quote, economic processes as collective ways of life that have been rendered hegemonic, enduring, and regular, end quote. Economic and political forms are regarded as the institutionalized outcomes of compromises struck between groups that are locked in a struggle to universalize their own respective ways of life. Indeed, the very distinction between state and society is cast as a, quote, retrospective effect of social conflicts and attempts at social differentiation, end quote. Even at this level, it remains unclear how these groups, variously referred to as, quote, classes or, quote, collectives, actually come into being, or upon what basis they become identifiable as classes in the first place. Both the specific ways of life adopted by these collectives, as well as their inherent contradictions, or conversely the struggle waged between them, are either simply presupposed conceptually or else explained via empty formulas involving universalized analytical distinctions drawn between individuals. Following Urs Lindner, one might characterize this approach as a, quote, conflict-centric ontology, end quote, one that adopts Paulinus' assertion that no classes exist prior to the struggle itself, and which then, quote, infers the primacy of, quote, struggles from the mere fact that domination is never entirely stable, end quote. In this context, Demirovich et al. Regards certain conditions of social interaction as mere resultant outcomes of conflicting forces that, while indeed setting actional boundaries for future conduct, possess no fundamental autonomy vis-a-vis the actors, nor do they exert structural constraints upon them. Thus, for instance, Demirovich rejects the concept of reification, yet he himself conceives of it in a reified manner. Quote, it is now a matter of an overpowering, alienated structure that has detached itself from the actions of individuals, and is no longer mediated by them, end quote. The persistence of institutionalized rules is thus held to derive solely from the, quote, large membership numbers of social collectives, unquote. The strategy of formal theory of the social is thereby fundamentally undermined. First, Gramsci's critique of the objectivism inherent in Marxist-Leninist philosophy of history is coupled with a specific interpretation of Marx's statements. Gramsci conceives of social objectivity as, quote, universal subjectivity, as something existing solely through the thought and action of human beings. This fundamental social theoretical premise is then seen as reflected in Marx's category of the, quote, objective thought form, unquote, which, standing squarely within the tradition of critical theory, is interpreted as a description of the ontological status of value, leading to the following conclusion, quote, thus if social relations such as capital, commodity exchange, wage labor, etc., were not lived out as a conscious and known practice, they could not reproduce themselves, unquote. The necessity of the law of value is, therefore, not an objectivist or deterministic one, but rather one constituted by the practice and knowledge of the actors involved. In this sense, Marx is said to suggest, quote, that equality and freedom must have become a general popular prejudice in order for commodity exchange in the market to be possible as a pattern of collective action, unquote. But what does Marx actually write? He states that the equality of labors as a condition enabling commodity exchange can, quote, only be deciphered once the concept of human equality has already acquired the firmness of a popular prejudice, unquote. However, this is, quote, only possible in a society where the commodity form has become the general form of the product of labor, unquote. Marx is therefore concerned with the question of the recognition of value substance, not with its production. Moreover, there is no suggestion that commodity exchange would be impossible without this prejudice, or that the latter in any way constitutes the former. According to Marx, the relationship is in fact quite the opposite. However, Demirovich does not merely reduce forms of wealth and coercion to statistical quantities and subjective patterns of interpretation. Demirovich also rejects any strategy of conceptual mediation between unconscious structural determinants, essence, and the conscious actions of actors, appearance. Conversely, the insight that patterns of interpretation cannot be reduced to the retrospective delegitimation or representation of pre-established social relations or, quote, extra-discursive interests, becomes an argument for a, quote, short-circuiting of action, quote, practical knowledge, and forms a move which ultimately reveals itself as a generalization of the performative character of social theory and individuals' interpretations of the world. Yet, as a result, those unconscious structures which assert themselves within conscious action, while being grounded in the societal relations of things, can no longer be conceptually grasped. Nor is Demirovich's polemic against the assertion of a, quote, abstract logic of capital, unquote, tenable. For here he claims that, quote, the valorization of capital cannot emerge as the result of an abstract logic of capital, but must instead be purposefully pursued by specific actors, unquote. Contrary to this assumption, however, is precisely the mediation between structure and action, and between essence and form of appearance, that constitutes the primary object of Marx's critique of political economy as a dialectical theory. The notion that, quote, derivation, in this specific theoretical sense, entails the immediate imposition of abstract laws upon empirical reality or the actions of subjects, can only stem from a confusion of this method with the, quote, false abstractions of classical economics and its procedures based on a logic of subsumption. Thus, the critique of, quote, economism at issue here is intertwined with far-reaching questions regarding a constitution theory of the social, grounded in the theory of action, which transcend the immediate context of our present discussion concerning a critique of the derivation of the state. New section, quote, circulation fixation. A specific variant of the critique of simple circulation conceived as the starting point for determining the bourgeois legal form, can be found in the works of Oscar Knecht, 1975, and Burkhard Tuschling, 1976. Central to their argument is the charge that the sphere of production is neglected in the determination of the nature of law. This critique is articulated most notably with reference to Pashukanis, whom they identify as the progenitor of the approach that derives law from simple circulation. According to this critique, Pashukanis situates the object and source of law, quote, exclusively within the sphere of circulation, end quote. Consequently, his legal theory is not only incapable of grasping the legal superstructure in its relative autonomy, but also becomes ensnared in a, quote, crypto-natural law, end quote, pattern of argumentation by conceptualizing law from the standpoint of contracting individuals and locating its essence in the free contract between independent subjects. From a Marxist perspective, this amounts to a repetition of the critique that Hans Kelsen had previously leveled against Pashukanis. Admittedly, however, unlike Kelsen, Knecht et al. Are not primarily concerned with emphasizing the coercive nature of state law, but rather with highlighting its class-specific character and its relationship to economic compulsions. Thus, Pashukanis fails to explain the distinction between bourgeois and pre-bourgeois legal relations, because he proceeds indiscriminately from the premise of the, quote, commodity form taken in itself, end quote. Yet this form, albeit as a marginal phenomenon, existed prior to the capitalist mode of production. Pashukanis, they argue, fails to provide a foundation for the universalization of the commodity form, and by extension for the, quote, development of the legal form into a general and necessary form, end quote, of social relations. According to Knecht, this stems from a misunderstanding of the systematic significance of the first three chapters of Marx's Capital, the primary source for the theory of the commodity form and legal form. Knecht argues that Pashukanis isolates the determinations of commodity owners, specifically their status as free and equal proprietors, from their broader social determinations as class-specific agents of production. However, were these latter determinations taken into account, it would become evident not only that the commodity form evolves into the characteristic social relation only on the basis of the capitalist class relation, but also that the, quote, production-mediated exchange, end quote, between wage laborers and capitalists is the sole basis for the constitution of law. Quote, not all commodities, nor even the commodity circulation mediated by contracts, but exclusively the commodity labor power constitutes the point of reference for the explanation of law, end quote. Accordingly, for Knecht, legal fetishism is to be understood not so much in terms of commodity fetishism, but rather in terms of the fetishism of the wage form. In contrast to Pashukanis' quasi, quote, natural law frame of reference, this approach thus takes into account the, quote, relations of reciprocal conditioning and dependence between capitalist organized production and law, end quote. The mediation of legal relations through the totality of capitalist production relations, and the systematic contamination of law by domination and structural constraints. Commodity exchange, along with its economic value and legal general relations of will implications, can thus be understood as forms of mediation and motion of the, quote, fundamental contradiction, end quote, of the capitalist mode of production, the legally constituted act of exchange, in which equal and free commodity owners confront one another, resolves the formation-specific problem of the, quote, combination of producers and means of production, end quote, as well as means of consumption, quote, on the basis of their separation, end quote. Specifically, it does so in such a way that, through this particular form of combination, this very separation is constantly reproduced. This becomes possible because the law abstracts from the substantive determinations of the commodity owners and their use values, and for both parties to the wage labor / capital exchange, insofar as they act as buyers, quote, imputes the appropriation of the use value of the commodity alienated by the respective other party to the wage laborer, therefore the use value of the equivalent commodity, to the capitalist the use value of labor power, end quote. Thereby, according to Marx, the capitalist is guaranteed both the gratuitous gift of labor, the preservation of the value of the means of production, and through the entire material portion of the product, the surplus value that has been produced. And thus, as a result of the capitalist production process, the reproduction of the separation of the producers from the means of production. Since the worker, through the act of exchange in its contractual form, has consented, quote, to cede the use value of his commodity to the buyer for a limited time, just as the seller or lessor of any other commodity promises to cede the use value of that commodity to the buyer in exchange for an equivalent, end quote. He consequently possesses no legal claim whatsoever to the product he has produced. Only by relating the legal form to these conditions of socialization, specifically to an order, quote, that interrelates all its members under the forms of freedom, equality, and reciprocity, and which, in principle, employs state legal coercion indiscriminately to guarantee these forms, end quote, can its function and its generalization into such an order be adequately grasped. Thus, the, quote, legal form as a systematic totality, end quote, is explicable not by proceeding from, quote, individual acts of exchange within the commodity form, but solely from the standpoint of the capitalist production relation, and only as, quote, a general form, end quote, backed by the threat of state coercion can one speak of the reality of law. Thus, underlying the criticisms raised by Neck and Tushling is not a competing conception of law, but rather a specific interpretation of Pashukanos' methodological framework. They impute to the commodity form/legal form theorem a historicist or empiricist reduction, specifically a reduction to a model involving two exchanging parties in the sense of the fiction of, quote, simple commodity production, quote, thereby attributing to it a naive conceptualization of both the commodity and the law that abstracts from their repressive conditions of constitution and function. Indeed, such an interpretation can draw support from ambiguous methodological remarks found in the book General Theory of Law and Marxism, for instance, where the text speaks of sketching the, quote, basic features of the historical and dialectical development of the legal form, end quote. Nevertheless, one must side with Andreas Harms against Necht and Tushling in asserting that, for Pashukanos, the concept of, quote, legal subjectivity and that of, quote, production-mediated exchange implicitly coincide, end quote. For despite certain historicist limitations, the book General Theory of Law and Marxism can, from a methodological standpoint, be characterized as a, quote, tacit heterodoxy, end quote. Its explicit agenda is the logical, systematic reconstruction of the legal form out of the commodity form. Accordingly, Pashukanos does not proceed from the premise of, quote, simple commodity production, end quote. Instead, he takes, quote, the fully developed legal form as the basis, end quote, for his analysis, and as demonstrated above, he by no means abstracts away from its intrinsic connection to capitalist relations of production. The, quote, practical purpose of legal mediation, end quote, lies in ensuring the, quote, unimpeded flow, end quote, of capitalist, quote, production and reproduction, end quote. In other words, for Pashukanos as well, law constitutes, quote, that specific process of mediation through which the connection between producers and the means of production, a connection indispensable to the production process itself, is socially affected, end quote. In response to the charge of being fixated on circulation, one can, following Harms, summarize as follows, quote, if legal concepts appear as concepts of circulation, this refers to the specific circulation of capitalist commodity production rather than that of a simple kind. This applies equally to the concepts of the legal subject and the legal relation. He, Pashukanos, does not understand these as a priori concepts, preordained by a specific mode of legal thought, but rather as concepts that can only be elucidated within the totality of the social context, end quote. Conversely, situating law within the immediate process of production would amount to a theory of the, quote, personally bound functionality of law, end quote, one that without regard for law's specific form would be compelled to reduce it, quote, to the particular interest of capital owners, quote. As early as 1977, Veit Michael Bader argued against Tushling that the critique regarding the alleged, quote, fixation on circulation, quote, adds nothing to Pashukanis' concept of law. Given this critique, Bader contended, even this critique, Bader contended, must understand the sphere of circulation as the specific site of the genesis of law, given that it neither advocates a statist concept of coercion or a command model of law, nor, crucially, wishes to fall into the trap of adopting a particularistic legal concept that blurs the distinction between capitalism and the pre-modern era. The conceptual derivation of the legal form from the determinations of simple circulation, Bader noted, does not imply restricting the validity of that form solely to supposedly simple acts of exchange. Moreover, even Tushling cannot avoid locating the specificity of law in its abstractness, which implies by extension its abstraction from the particular social contents of class relations. According to Bader, the charge of methodological inconsistency must, in fact, be leveled back at Tushling himself. Tushling, Bader argues, conflates the demand, which none of the alleged, quote, circulationists following Pashukanis have ever denied, to move from an analysis of simple circulation to an analysis of the capitalist production process, with the demand, quote, that the analysis must proceed from the totality of the capitalist production process as a whole. How one is supposed to grasp this totality all at once without analytically unfolding its constituent moments remains Tushling's secret, end quote. Bader. Section 3. Dialectical development of legal and state forms. One, from an analytical perspective, Hubert Rothleutner proposes that discourse concerning dialectical interconnections be understood initially as a placeholder for a yet-to-be-provided specification of relational types. Accordingly, he attempts to interpret the connection between the commodity form and the legal form, as posited by Marx, as a causal relation of a specific, namely historical nature. Although he too acknowledges, for instance, non-historical relations of coexistence as types of causal relationships, he proceeds from the premise that, in explaining the relationship between the commodity form and the legal form, quote, the state of affairs described in the antecedent, bracket, here commodity exchange, precedes the explanandum event, here the legal form, end quote. One is thus dealing with a historical sequence of a causal nature. If WF, then necessarily following in time, RF. In the context of clarifying the connection between the commodity form and the legal form, Rothleutner therefore draws upon a wide variety of explanatory approaches found in the works of Marx and Engels in order to substantiate this thesis. He cites, for example, Marx's reflections on the relationship between the function of money as a means of payment and, quote, legally enforceable private contracts among commodity owners, end quote. Marx, he argues, thereby delineates the difference between the factual exchange relations and their legal structure along the lines of the distinction between, on the one hand, actual performance and counter-performance in an exchange where the two do not diverge in time, an economic relationship, and on the other hand, an ideal, promised, yet state-enforceable counter-performance in cases where the transfer of the commodity and the payment of money are temporarily separated, a legal relationship. Rothleutner's thesis that Marx thereby explains the legal regulation of economic exchange acts as arising from a specific historical stage of commodity circulation, in which money functions as a means of payment, completely ignores, however, those passages from Marx's Capital and the notes on Wagner that Rothleutner himself cites. in which case Marx sets forth the fundamental legal structure of commodity exchange per se. It is not merely when the transfer of the commodity and the transfer of money diverge in time, rather, whenever an exchange takes place, that the exchanging parties must, quote, tacitly recognize one another as equal persons and as owners of the respective goods they are exchanging, quote. Nor is there any mention here of a temporal sequence, but rather of a systematic relationship of coexistence or mutual implication between commodity exchange and legal form. Rottleutner thus not only overlooks the structural connection between commodity exchange and law in favor of specific statutory regulations governing specific exchange relations. He also evidently views Marx's Capital as a work of historical analysis. Yet Marx speaks of, quote, developed exchange as the starting point for his explanation of law, by which he refers to the universalized commodity circulation characteristic of capitalism. Furthermore, the attribution of the money's function as a medium of circulation, the temporarily immediate exchange of commodity for money, to an economic relation, while assigning its function as a means of payment to a legal relation, can hardly be interpreted as an accurate reconstruction of Marx's view. Aside from ignoring the legal dimension inherent even in the temporarily immediate exchange of commodity for money, such an interpretation would imply that exchange involving money as a means of payment constitutes a legal form, whereas exchange involving money as a medium of circulation is a purely economic one. The tacit relation of autonomous will, inherent in the exchange of commodities, or whatever kind, are interpreted by Rottleutner as, quote, ethical and moral norms, end quote, to which a legal form is supposedly subsequently imparted through state legislation. Now the somewhat loose phrasing in Marx's marginal notes does indeed invite the misconception that he reserves the designation of, quote, law solely for the legally developed contractual form backed by the threat of state coercion. The tacit mutual recognition of individuals as private property owners and the appropriation of others' commodities through a free agreement of wills is characterized therein as a, quote, factual relation springing up through and within the exchange itself, end quote, which supposedly, quote, later receives legal form in the contract, etc., end quote. However, the phrasing in Marx's Capital is more precise, characterizing this mutual recognition as a, quote, legal relation whose form is the contract, whether legally developed or not, end quote. Rottleutner's empiricist stance on this issue thus not only perceives historical sequences where structural simultaneities are actually at play, it also tacitly presupposes from the very outset a fully formed and completely determined concept of law, understood specifically as state-codified and state-guaranteed private law. It is only for this reason that the relations of will among commodity owners appear to him not as law, but merely as empirically real moral norms. The fact that Marx is concerned with the systematic exchange of commodities, in which the relations of will among the actors are implicitly embedded as reciprocal relations of recognition between free and equal property owners, is further obscured by Rottleutner's analysis by the thesis that merely, quote, factual relations cannot possibly generate a legal form, in the sense of a legal permission, given that the nature of law, after all, invariably revolves around the permission or prohibition of specific factual actions. It is thus tacitly assumed here that the, quote, factual relation to which Marx refers is merely some arbitrary contingent act, one devoid of any particular systemic significance within the broader process of the socialization of labor. The interpretation of the relationship between the commodity form and the legal form as a historical causal relation thus appears not to do justice to the Marxian claim. 2. A more precise formulation of the claim already present in Lepla's work for a dialectical presentation of the legal form can be found in the contribution by Lars Meyer. In doing so, he proceeds from the motif of an isomorphic structure underlying the derivation of religious, monetary, and state forms, a motif that first appeared in the work of Helmut Reichelt and can be traced through various contributions to the debate. Meyer now inquires into the possibility of a dialectical presentation of law. Quote, is the development of a general concept of law, in the sense of presenting private law institutions, contract legal form, as forms of the increasing autonomization of a basal principle of juridical unity, conceivable, unquote. Meyer thus attempts to address the central problematic in Pashukanis' work, namely the need to define the concept of law as pre-statist while simultaneously having to incorporate the guarantee of law through state coercive power, by drawing a parallel with the conceptual unfolding of value forms in the dialectical presentation of capitalist wealth forms, specifically the progression from simple to complex and from dependent to autonomous forms. This serves to fill a gap in object theoretical terms, a gap that, in Pashukanis' work, resulted from a methodological ambiguity regarding the character of the dialectical presentation of wealth and legal forms. Given that his account still conflated empirical and logical determinations. In both contexts, here is there. The concept of the quote beginning would then have to be conceptualized as the quote simple, understood as something underdetermined, as a starting point to be interrogated regarding its necessary preconditions. As Meyer puts it, quote, there exists a process of objectification in which this genuinely legal will assumes various forms of appearance, a process which in turn presupposes the existence of production relations, unquote. Meyer. Analogous to Marx and Pashukanis, Meyer conceives of the, quote, principle of law, unquote, as a relationship of private autonomous wills established within the context of exchange, specifically as a concordance of the wills of commodity owners in the act of exchange, as their mutual recognition as free and equal subjects. This shared volitional relationship, he argues, assumes the de facto legal form of the contract, serving as a binding constraint upon individual wills. However, due to the specific constellation of interest inherent to private autonomous production units, this concept of abstract law is unable to fulfill the demand for universal validity. Quote, the required universality of validity vanishes in the face of the arbitrariness of the individual will, unquote. While the legal principle may indeed be, quote, formulated without codification, unquote, in this context, it necessarily exists thereby in a, quote, vanishing state. Much as value, prior to assuming the forms of money and capital, exist only in a, quote, vanishing state. Consequently, the form truly adequate to the legal principle, the form that corresponds to the, quote, reality of the concept's universality, unquote, is realized solely through legislative codification, enactment, the legislative function, and the state's threat of coercion. Guarantee, the executive function. It is only within the state-issued general norm of statutory law that the legal form thus comes to correspond to the legal concept. Quote, under what conditions is it possible for contracts to be consistently upheld, that is, for the identical will to possess genuine validity, analogous to the problem of value abstraction and its unification within the form of price? There exists the problem of legal abstraction and its unification within the form of law, unquote. The realization of law's transition into reality occurs, quote, in the acts of codification, unquote. The, quote, abstract unity of property owners is posited for itself within the framework of private law and is ultimately endowed with the state's power of sanction, unquote. Where am I? Sonia Buckle also pursues a parallelization of commodity form and legal form. In doing so, she follows Joachim Hirsch in his definition of the concept of, quote, form as the autonomized, reified, and fetishized guise of a specific social relation, one that renders social antagonisms processable. Drawing upon Helmut Brentel's differentiation of the economic concept of form, law is initially conceived here as a real abstractive form of the social unity of actors, for one, parallel to value, subsequently, as a synthesis of wills under specific conditions, form 3, the social conditions under which the wills must assume the guise of law, and finally, with the consequence of their systematic dissociation into privately isolated entities. This level of legal form, which is constantly, albeit unconsciously, practiced and reproduced in the everyday capitalist lives of actors, requires a material mode of existence, namely, quote, juridical procedures. These procedures, manifesting as court proceedings, legislative and administrative acts, and legal doctrine, ensure that, quote, law is not left to the everyday actions of subjects, end quote. This, quote, legal form 2 corresponds to the value form, or specifically to Brentel's form 2, as the material mode of representation for value. It constitutes a representation of everyday legal practices, one that simultaneously incorporates legal subjects into the legal order as individuals subject to its specific rules, linguistic codes, and mechanisms of social exclusion, while simultaneously effacing the traces of law's autonomization from everyday practice. Thus, the relative autonomy of law, encompassing both its reliance on everyday practice and its own independence and institutional density, is thereby demonstrated. This relative autonomy of law, its immunity to the encroachment of particular interest or specific volitional contents, is therefore already latent in the abstract general, legal form 1, yet becomes solidified within these juridical procedures. The ambivalence of law, it is argued, lies in its detachment from the, quote, life world, from the principles of rational steering and popular sovereignty, and simultaneously in the, quote, delaying and hindering of the direct assertion of power claims, end quote. Quote, only when the legal form exists in its relational autonomy, which renders direct access impossible, or at least significantly more difficult, even for powerful social actors, can one speak of, quote, law in bourgeois capitalist societies with respect to social norms, end quote. In this context, the state's monopoly on the legitimate use of force constitutes merely one of the enabling conditions for the autonomy of the legal form, or of even greater importance are the courts, with their, quote, de-paradoxification techniques, end quote, of final adjudication, or legal doctrine, with its own techniques of systematization and hegemonic interpretation, parenthesis, the, quote, prevailing opinion, end quote, of individual legal norms. Thus, the inherent ambiguity and lack of ultimate grounding of legal norms, as well as the power struggles embedded within them, are temporarily frozen and rendered invisible in a specific hegemonic form. Four, the motif of a structural homology between money and the state, conceived as, quote, problem-solving structures, end quote, can also be found in Dieter Sauer's 1978 study on the state and the state apparatus. Dieter Sauer presents the state as a problem-solving form, yet simultaneously as an apparatus permeated by the very contradictions it is tasked with resolving. He views the general structure of such problem-solving forms as prefigured within dialectical contradiction and its specific modes of motion. A contradiction which induces a problem of social reproduction is processed and rendered tractable through the separation of its imminently interconnected poles, their relative autonomization, and their subsequent external mediation. Under conditions of a private division of labor, Sauer argues, quote, the individuals enter into interpersonal relations with one another solely through the objective relations of the commodities of which they are owners, end quote. The contradiction between matter and form, immanent to the commodity and characteristic of capitalist socialization, thus articulates itself at the level of social action as a conflict between the particular opposing interest of individual commodity owners and their general shared interest. To satisfy their particular private needs situated beyond the act of exchange and derived from the material specificity of their respective sources of income, commodity owners are necessarily dependent upon the act of exchange itself. Just as concrete labor may manifest itself as abstract labor and use value as value, so too must the satisfaction of materially concrete interests be referred back to the general relations of mutual recognition among commodity owners as free and equal legal subjects. However, the legal personality that springs from the objective mediation of the social relations between different forms of labor, that is, the existence of commodity suppliers as representatives of things of equal value, emerges as a, quote, structural effect of exchange occurring, quote, behind the backs of individuals, end quote, rather than as the result of a shared, consciously articulated and solidaristic interest. The dual character of individuals under capitalism, the necessity of being simultaneously a particular private owner and an abstractly equal person, thus necessitates a specific mode of motion distinct from the individuals themselves. The abstract general moment of their juridical form constitutes itself in the guise of a third instance, autonomous vis-a-vis the subjects themselves, namely the extra-economic state power responsible for establishing and guaranteeing the law. Through the separation of contradictory poles, their autonomization in the form of the state, and the subsequent reestablishment of a relationship between the institutionalized general and the particular, the problem of socialization inherent in the substance-form contradiction can now be addressed. The form of the state in this context results, quote, from the conditions of its separation, quote. It is nothing other than the distinct existence of the general moment within the volitional relations of commodity owners. However, according to Sauer, not all forms of movement associated with the central problems of socialization should be conceptualized as state-based. He distinguishes between value-immanent, interest-determined, and politically determined forms of resolution or movement regarding the substance-value contradiction. According to Sauer, however, the state, conceived as a form of resolution for the contradiction between substance and value, is itself entangled within this contradictory structure. It is compelled to address the problems arising from this contradiction, which is specific to this particular social formation, without being permitted to resolve the contradiction itself. The fundamental contradiction inherent in state action lies in the fact that the reproduction of the general conditions for capitalist reproduction constitutes, at the same time, the reproduction of a social nexus that exists solely through the interrelationship of competing individual capitals. Although the valorization strategies of individual capitals constantly jeopardize the material conditions of the reproduction process. The, quote, preservation of the autonomy of individual capitals as a systemic condition for the system's continued existence, end quote, is nevertheless presupposed. The fundamental contradiction manifests itself in various dilemmas of state regulation, which can invariably be characterized as variations on the theme of the state's separation from the economy, serving simultaneously as the very form of its dependence upon it. The state's engagement with general legal or material conditions of reproduction remains contingent upon the process of value formation and the private interests of commodity owners. Furthermore, the state's relationship to these material conditions is mediated through the abstract general forms of law and money, meaning that the very mechanisms that generate these problems serve simultaneously as the media through which the state attempts to address them. Thus, the state emerges as a structure that is simultaneously constraining functioning as a negative barrier to valorization, and constrained, dependent upon the valorization process as the source of its own material and financial resources. Section 4. Democracy and its revenants. First heading. Quote, the in/adequacy of democracy. At the center of the state derivation debate lies not only the relationship between the form of the rule of law and the capitalist economy, but also the nexus between bourgeois democracy and capitalist socialization. Here, however, assessments oscillate between the categories of necessity, adequacy, and contingency. 1. The PKA initially conceives of the parliamentary democratic republic as a, quote, form of state, quote, where the existence of the modern state corresponds to its essence, end quote, end quote. This can be justified in two ways. First, on the basis of the functional imperative to institutionally establish the collective interests of the bourgeoisie, the, quote, actual fusion of all property owners, end quote, and thereby prevent, quote, the rule of one faction of the ruling class over all other classes, the rule of the financial aristocracy over society, or the personal rule of a monarch or dictator, end quote. Second, the integration, effected through universal suffrage, of the interests of the working class into the sphere of political rule also stems from the abolition of feudal rule based on privilege, an abolition inherent in the very forms of money and capital. The bourgeoisie is thereby, quote, compelled to recognize equality in principle, that is, to abolish all arbitrary privileges and special liberties, and to make the electoral principle the foundation of its government. End quote. To formulate this somewhat more precisely than the PKA managed to do at its particular level of theoretical reflection, which remains encumbered by various residues of agency theory, as Pashukanis already pointed out, only a state power characterized by the expropriation of personal proprietary rule and exercised through abstract general norms can truly be termed, quote, public power, end quote. That is, quote, a power that belongs to no one in particular, stands above all, and addresses itself to all, end quote. Consequently, however, the consistently public character of state power, and thus the complete separation of politics and economics, is already also inextricably linked to universal suffrage, as Marx had already demonstrated on the Jewish question. However, the PKA now falls short of this insight, albeit cloaked in dialectically draped formulas, by characterizing representative democracy as a, quote, mere form that is alien to the content itself, yet for that very reason corresponds to it all the more, end quote. Here democracy is once again regarded merely as a manipulative illusion, capable of functioning only in the presence of a weakly developed class consciousness among the working class. Parliamentary democracy is therefore ultimately conceptualized as a, quote, form of transformation of bourgeois society, end quote. In this context, and in accordance with its own stated ambition, the political form of the transformation of capitalism into socialism is to be derived at the conceptual level itself. Underlying this assumption are patterns of argumentation rooted in historical determinism. The view that working class interests are, in principle, system transcending interpretations of the genesis of revolutionary class consciousness based on the theory of immiseration and the, quote, homogenization thesis, end quote, regarding the simplification. Jesus Christ, something's just falling in my eye. think I knocked it out. Maybe not. Where the hell am I? Alright, I'm going to go back a couple sentences probably, so forgive me. Here, democracy is once again regarded merely as a manipulative illusion, capable of functioning only in the presence of a weakly developed class consciousness among the working class. Parliamentary democracy is therefore ultimately conceptualized as a, quote, form of transformation of bourgeois society, end quote. In this context, in accordance with its own stated ambition, the political form of the transformation of capitalism into socialism is to be derived at the conceptual level itself. Underlying this assumption are patterns of argumentation rooted in historical determinism. The view that working class interests are, in principle, system transcending, interpretations of the genesis of revolutionary class consciousness based on the theory of immiseration, and the, quote, homogenization thesis, end quote, regarding the simplification of the class structure within bourgeois society. Following Marx, the inherently contradictory core of bourgeois democracy is identified in the fact that, through universal suffrage, it strips the ruling class of the, quote, political guarantees for the preservation of its social power, thereby placing on the agenda the fundamental threat to the foundations of bourgeois society posed by the votes of the proletarian majority. Implicit in this argument is the premise that the proletariat possesses a fundamental interest arising directly from its economic conditions of existence in the overthrow of the capitalist order. Thus, it is argued the proletarian party is capable of shattering the integrative functions of parliament, in which the opposition serves merely as a, quote, safety valve, precisely because it stands in open opposition to bourgeois rule. However, this would only be achieved once a spontaneous process of disillusionment was set in motion within the minds of the proletarians, a process triggered by the impoverishment of the working class and the state's failure to satisfy its demands for social reform, which would expose the state's incapacity for action and coincide with the discrediting of the electoral promises made by successive governing parties. The intensification of class struggle, which thus indirectly ensues from the economic crisis, would then lead the bourgeoisie to prefer open dictatorship or regression to a personalized form of class rule at the state level over bourgeois democracy. Indeed, surrendering political power via the executive appears to them as the sole means of safeguarding their social power as a capitalist class. Thus, the Bonapartist dictatorship, the most extreme form of the state apparatus's autonomy vis-a-vis bourgeois society, is derived directly from bourgeois society's own internal tendencies and identified as the conservative mode of existence of mature capitalism. This teleological interpretive framework is subsequently called into question in the course of the ensuing discussion. Bernhard Blanke begins by challenging the assumption that the democratic representative system constitutes the social form of bourgeois rule. This approach, he argues, overlooks, quote, the fact that the bourgeois society is characterized precisely by a cycle of political forms of rule in which, quote, states of exception, end quote, have been just as numerous and significant as the, quote, normal state. However, the fact that the establishment of authoritarian or fascist regimes has invariably represented a product of capitalist crisis demonstrates that while these crises are indeed to be understood as products of bourgeois society, they do not constitute its defining characteristic. Such an assessment simultaneously challenges the teleological and unilinear concept of the PKA, which posits a developmental trajectory leading from the, quote, normal form of democracy to the, quote, permanent exceptional form, end quote, of Bonapartism. A further argument against elevating the parliamentary republic to the status of an ideal form lies in the fact that authoritarian and fascist state forms too, quote, must resolve identical problems, end quote, as does the democratic one, given that both are confronted with the functional imperatives of a capitalist economy. Functional equivalence for the mediation of divergent interests and for the representation as a unified body politic, can invariably be found even within these, quote, exceptional states. Three, following Helmut Reichelt, Heide Gerstenberger takes her critique a step further. Against Flatov/Huisken and the Marxist group, the objection is raised that they hypostatize the contemporary degree of the working class's integration into the bourgeois state, treating as a constitutive moment in the conceptual derivation of that class interest structure. Quote, striking workers, who in the 19th and even into the 20th century were ridden down by police cavalry and fired upon, presumably experienced precious little in the way of bourgeois recognition of their specific interests. Okay. Nor, she argues, does the thesis regarding the state's administration, even of the workers' interest qua owner of a revenue source, adequately account for the, quote, long-standing persistence of fascist and authoritarian bourgeois regimes, end quote. It is, therefore, quote, by no means a foregone conclusion whether formal equality, universal suffrage, and democratic structures are truly commensurate with the capitalist mode of production, end quote. Countering these objections, Gerstenberger posits a specific variant of the theorem of democracy as a form of the dissolution of bourgeois rule. The realization of formal freedom and equality, she argues, ultimately undermines the hopes the subaltern classes place in the bourgeois democratic system, and must therefore be understood as a, quote, precondition for severe systemic upheavals, end quote. Four, Norbert Kostetta counters that the fact that a political form had to be, quote, fought for does not in itself constitute an argument against its formal adequacy with respect to capitalist class rule, a point already demonstrated by the function of the welfare state. However, an objection is also raised against the PKA, namely that, quote, anyone who speaks of, quote, adequate forms thereby simultaneously implies that the notion of necessity, in the strict sense of a logical derivation, is not particularly well-founded, end quote. Finally, the transition to the, quote, dissolution theorem is said to stem from an unreflective, emphatic concept of democracy held by the PKA, a concept best explained as the result of a retrospective and external correlation between the abstract universal public form of the political and bourgeois class rule. Indeed, the PKA still adheres to a latent, quote, manipulation theory, end quote, regarding legal and state forms, speaking uninhibitedly of the, quote, abuse of democracy by the bourgeoisie. In opposition to the, quote, emphatic concept of democracy, which posits an absolute external antagonism between capitalism and democracy, emphasis is placed instead on the formal congruity of the two. This emphatic concept of democracy is held to stem from a theoretical failure to grasp the intrinsic connection between the public impersonal forms of the political realm and capitalist class rule. Furthermore, it is accompanied by a, quote, misguided accusation of fascism, end quote, leveled against repressive state measures which, after all, quote, invariably appear fascist to anyone who conceives of the forms of interaction within bourgeois democracy as being free from political class violence, end quote. Against the conflation of necessity with adequacy, The historical reality of bourgeois societies, with their frequent recurring states of exception, is adduced. Conversely, it is argued that this factual coincidence of authoritarianism and fascism with capitalism proves nothing against the appropriateness of parliamentary forms of capitalist reproduction. Rather, the question that arises concerns the durability of the compatibility between authoritarian rule and capitalist socialization. Costetta therefore proposes an alternative model of the relationship between the universalized commodity exchange and democracy. Costetta distinguishes a structural determination of bourgeois democracy by capitalist commodity exchange from a functional determination of the laws of appropriation inherent in commodity exchange by democracy, and distinguishes both in turn from a deterministic web of conditions involving both elements. The structural connection, he argues, points to the fact that commodity exchange functions as an enabling condition for democratic forms. Quote, the qualities of freedom and equality possessed by subjects of exchange are reproduced in their forms of political interaction, end quote. Countering the assumption that democratic structures are entirely contingent, one must recognize that their enduring institutionalization would remain enigmatic. Quote, if they were to permanently thwart economic mechanisms, end quote, or to be utterly incommensurable with their forms. However, this structural determination, which highlights the correspondence between economic and political forms, anonymous rule in the former sphere, public rule in the latter, does not constitute a guarantee for the actual institutionalization of democratic structures. Such institutionalization is forged through historical struggles and therefore always entails an element of relative contingency. For this reason, one might speak of a, quote, indirect structural determination, end quote. Moreover, in a narrower sense, democracy constitutes the adequate state form of capitalist socialization. Forms of overt violence and arbitrary personal rule by specific groups are, quote, in the long run, end quote, incompatible with the functional conditions of commodity exchange. They jeopardize the substitution of violence within the economy, as well as the containment of executive power and the structures of compromise among class factions. The risk that the general interest of capital might be undermined by particular capitalist interests, specifically through the violent intervention of a specific faction into the laws of commodity exchange, and thus into the very conditions of its long-term existence, is thereby heightened to a disproportionate degree. Conversely, it must be noted that political legal principles, such as universal and equal suffrage, freedom of association, representative bodies, the free formation of public opinion and political will, the separation of powers, etc., quote, reinforce the functional conditions of commodity exchange, thereby, quote, the differentiation of state power vis-a-vis all social classes and individuals, and its stance of non-intervention regarding economic exchange and distribution processes is optimally realized, end quote. However, this functional determination of commodity exchange by democracy is in turn no guarantee of its actual realization. On the contrary, depending on the prevailing social conjuncture, one must acknowledge the relative and temporary nature of democracy's functionality. Consequently, forms of state other than democracy, provided they are grounded in capitalism, are by no means ruled out. Indeed, in specific economic and political crisis situations, they may even be required. Thus, one can speak of a, quote, compulsion toward democracy, end quote, only in a significantly qualified sense. This implies a broad spectrum of historically variable conditions for the emergence and development of bourgeois democracy, a spectrum which Costetta elucidates, drawing upon the work of Guerin Terborn. Costetta's reflections bring into sharp focus both the substantive merits and the limitations of the derivation approach. No necessary connection exists between capitalism and democracy, nor is such a connection asserted by the majority of proponents of the state derivations theory. At the same time, the form analytical approach points to structural correspondences and functional effects within the relationship between commodity exchange and democracy, aspects that any analysis of capitalism ignores, only at the risk of becoming naive. Here, reference must be made to the concept of, quote, emphatic democracy, which, according to Costetta, rests upon a, quote, super-abstraction of the determinations of simple circulation, an abstraction from the specific economic form determinations of the dimensions of freedom and equality as mediated by commodity-money relations, relations which are themselves still viewed abstractly, i.e. without being fully grasped in light of their underlying causes within the relations of unfreedom and inequality characteristic of the overall production process. I don't know why I said that like that. Process. The critique of democracy, formulated in this manner, ultimately stands in the tradition of Marx's own intention to reflect upon the very limits of political emancipation. It is only at this juncture, quote, where the existence of the modern state corresponds to its essence, end quote, that is, where political determinations align in their full scope with the potentials for freedom and equality inherent in the principle of exchange, and can be advanced no further within that framework, that quote, those defects, which are not merely relative but absolute, and which constitute the very essence of the state, can be examined and characterized, end quote. Five. In 1975, Thomas Blanca fundamentally challenged the formal analytical approach to legal and democratic critique. He drew an ideal typical contrast between the two main currents of leftist constitutional interpretation in the Federal Republic. First, a, quote, historico-political approach oriented toward the work of Wolfgang Abendroth, which focused on the empirical analysis of the Constitution's genesis, as well as the normative interpretation of its contents, and which understood the basic law as a historical compromise between bourgeois and anti-capitalist currents that could serve as a starting point for a legal practice of transformation toward a socialist mode of production. Opposing this, and presented by the positions of the, quote, derivation debate, end quote, stood a, quote, capital logic objectivist, end quote, approach. This perspective interpreted the basic law as an adequate expression of capitalist domination, denied the existence of system transcending elements, and rejected any anti-capitalist strategy, if it remained legalistic and confined within the existing legal and state forms, as illusory and, quote, jurist socialist, end quote. In response to the alleged theoretical abstinence of one tendency and the hostility toward empiricism of the other, Blanca proposes a model of inquiry that, taking the process of capital reproduction as its starting point, reconstructs the interest structure of social classes as expressed in legal positions, and concretely traces the process of their institutionalization, as well as their repercussions on the economy. From this vantage point, the dilemma of the capital logic approach comes particularly into focus, namely its tendency to gloss over the actual contradictory nature of legal demands and their institutional materialization in favor of an abstract correlation between economic and politico-legal forms. On the one hand, capital logic allegedly fails to account for the genesis of legal positions within class struggles and their institutionalization as compromises in state legislation, while ex post it may often appear as though the victories of the working class are invariably aligned with the interests of aggregate capital. One must not on that account overlook the contradictory process by which legal norms are constituted, for in the course of class struggles there always exists the possibility that demands initially imminent to the system and relating, in the broadest sense, to securing the revenue source represented by labor power might, quote, turn against the blinkered form of these production relations themselves, end quote. The task of the state, in such instances, is to distinguish those claims capable of integration from those that are dysfunctional, and to address them separately, Indeed, the abstract possibility that system-immanent legal claims might be transcended can hardly be denied. Yet Blanca conflates the possibility with an actual reality, without citing a concrete case as evidence or even theoretically deriving this possibility. Moreover, the term, quote, contradictory preemptively suggests a transgression of interests capable of integration, and even though the very contradictoriness of these interests constitutes the specific mode of reproduction and constitution of the central production relation under capitalism, for despite being opposed, they nonetheless share a common frame of reference, the successful accumulation of capital. According to Blanca, it is not only its genesis within the class movement that reveals contradictory elements permitting a rupture of the systemic framework, but also its status as state law. In this regard, he aligns himself without further elaboration with the position of Wolfgang Abendroth. Abendroth deduces from the designation of the Federal Republic as a, quote, democratic and social constitutional state, unquote, in Article 2 of the Basic Law, that the liberal assumption of an inherent justice within the autonomous economic system is thereby shelved, and that the social order as a whole is placed at the disposal of the shaping will of a democratically legitimized state. The legal principle, he argues, is buttressed by the socio-ethical obligation attached to private property in Article 14, and, through Article 15, possesses a concrete instrument for the socialization of such property. Finally, Article 79 prevents any revision of this social state legal principle through legislative decisions, thereby permanently securing the possibility of a legal transformation of the social order through, quote, majority constellations within the legislative bodies, unquote. Abendroth interprets the concrete form of the Basic Law as a compromise between conflicting forces that conceived of the social state principle on the one hand as a subsidiary intervention into the capitalist economy, and on the other as a means for the rational shaping of economic processes in the spirit of social democracy. Blanca's recourse to Abendroth emphasizes this, quote, compromise thesis, without, however, reflecting upon its questionable premises regarding state theory. Thus, Abendroth views increasing state interventionism per se as a dissolution of the separation between state and society, seeing himself confronted with only one alternative, quote, monopoly power or democratically legitimized state intervention, end quote. In this view, the political legal form is tacitly assumed to serve as both the medium and the finished embodiment of social emancipation, an assumption that exposes precisely that hostility toward theory which Blanca, too, appears to critique merely pro forma in the context of the, quote, historical political approach, unquote. Finally, Blanca raises an objection against an objective functional analysis of law, arguing that, with its systemic focus on the conditions for the reproduction of total capital, such an analysis screens out the subjective interpretations of the actors involved. In doing so, he contends, it undermines the, quote, experiential context, unquote, of class struggles and the interpretation of hard-won legal positions as victories for the working class and as proof of the rational, quote, changeability of the social status quo, end quote. This experience, he maintains, constitutes a, quote, important element for the potential emergence of class consciousness, end quote. Here, too, concepts are employed in a suggestive manner, for instance, by tending to conflate class consciousness with revolutionary consciousness. Furthermore, instead of offering a substantive argument regarding the interpretation of the working class's conceptions of law, a motivational discourse is initiated that ultimately boils down to the assertion, quote, I will not tolerate pessimists, end quote. However, to exempt the subjective interpretations of actors from an analysis of origins and functions grounded in the critique of ideology would, in effect, amount to an outright abandonment of critical theory building. Blanca identifies the second dimension of contradiction in constitutional development, one denied by the logic of capital, in the specific retroactive effect of law upon economic processes in late capitalism. In doing so, Blanca relies primarily on Lelio Basso's stamocap approach. For Basso, state interventionist measures serve as an indication of an increasing, quote, social organization of production, end quote, which is understood as an anticipation of a post-capitalist social formation. The legal organization of state intervention, therefore, is seen as reflecting the intensifying contradiction between, quote, social production and, quote, private appropriation, and is thus no longer merely an expression of private capitalism. However, the thesis regarding the, quote, antagonistic moments of a new quality of a socialization, end quote, allegedly embedded in both the economic and legal systems, stands or falls with the assumption that the sphere of the industrial production process can be unproblematically regarded as a model for direct socialization under socialism. Once again, through an implicit recourse to Engels, the despotism of the factory regime is reinterpreted as a form of emancipatory rationality, and capitalist relations of production are reduced to specific legal forms characteristic of traditional paternalistic, quote, master in one's own house, end quote, entrepreneurship. Once again, capitalism is understood as being in essence already, quote, social production, end quote, a system that merely needs to shed the now desubstantialized husk of capital. This, it is suggested, can be achieved without difficulty through the legal instrument of late capitalist state interventionism. In summary, Blanca's objections can be interpreted as an attempt to reanimate and immunize by appeals to their supposed higher degree of concreteness those traditional Marxist paradigms of the stamocap approach of social democratic statism that were fundamentally critiqued by the state derivation debate. This is all the more regrettable given that his contribution raises entirely legitimate questions regarding how to bridge radical form critiques of bourgeois democracy with concrete constitutional analyses and strategies. While it is indeed unconvincing, as Blanca attempts to do, to interpret the insistence of the bourgeois character of a constitution, alongside the simultaneous defense of its rule of law and social welfare elements, as a logical inconsistency within a legal theoretical position, his warning regarding the potentially disastrous political consequences of a form critique of democracy nevertheless strikes at the very heart of certain unreflective positions within that critique. For in contexts other than the one cited by Blanca, there do indeed exist approaches that have, quote, developed from the fundamental class character of law and state, a complete ... Let me repeat that sentence. For in contexts other than the one cited by Blanca, there do indeed exist approaches that have, quote, developed from the fundamental class character of law and the state, a complete ... political indifference toward the specific form of bourgeois rule, unquote. For instance, the Marxist group fixates on a principled critique of capital in the state, one imbued with the underlying assumption that one should not lift a finger prior to the communist revolution, precisely because, after all, quote, a state is a state, and quote, capital is capital, unquote. This attitude is exemplified by the rejection of any and all forms of anti-fascism. New heading, quote, state of law and administrative measures. In the course of the preceding discussion, the impression may have arisen that the theory of the derivation of the state suffers from a, quote, legalistic bias, one that excludes from its categorical framework both the possibility of, quote, exceptional state formations of capitalism and the, quote, increasing decoupling of state action from the legislative process, unquote, which has been diagnosed by various observers even in the context of non-authoritarian capitalism. Indeed, this very criticism is frequently leveled, for instance by Joachim Hirsch, against positions such as those held by Blanca et al. Hirsch diagnoses in these views the, quote, untenable thesis regarding the pervasive juridical formality of the exercise of state power, unquote. However, within the context of the derivation of the state, an emphasis on the rule of law, form of the organization of capitalist domination, need not necessarily place this form in a fundamental opposition to direct extra-legal measures undertaken by the state. In what follows, drawing upon two distinct theoretical positions, an attempt will be made to outline a conceptual integration of the, quote, rule less exception, end quote, into the formal determination of modern statehood. Sorry, let me try to find my place here in the actual text itself. Okay. 1. Ulrich K. Preuss was likely the first to address this subject in depth, taking as his starting point concrete constitutional problems within the Federal Republic. He attempts to elucidate the, quote, principle of a dialectic between ordinary law and exceptional law, end quote. Preuss identifies the problem of a, quote, two-tiered legality, end quote, as being inherent both in the basic law itself and in the constitutional jurisprudence of the Federal Republic. He argues that, based on the wording of Articles 2, 18, 21, and 19 of 2, 18, 21, and 91 of the Basic Law, this framework facilitates a dichotomy. On the one hand, a democratically grounded legality, understood as the sum total of all articles of the Basic Law, and, on the other, a substantive legally undefined, quote, superlegality situated above the actual Constitution. In particular, the phrase, quote, liberal democratic basic order, end quote, thereby shifts from being a legally intelligible collective term for the basic law in its entirety to a diffuse substantive concept representing a value judgment prior to that legal order, one that permits the restriction or revocation of fundamental rights in the name of a higher order freedom. According to Preuss, this specifically German constitutional structure can be understood as a manifestation of a duality within the principle of legality, a duality that is, by its very nature, inherent in all bourgeois constitutions. The two-tiered nature of the concept of legality, and by extension the systematic integration of extra-legal measures into the framework of bourgeois constitutions, is interpreted as an expression of state action that is necessarily oriented toward the requirements of both the capitalist valorization process and the labor process. Only by proceeding from the fictitious model of simple commodity production, it is argued, could one assume that the, quote, guarantee of the abstract legal person and its social intercourse coincides with the guarantee of the concrete material conditions of this social intercourse, end quote. However, the abstract legal form of the private property owner, enshrined in general law, and the economic form of exchange are, in fact, forms of a concrete material content, yet the reproduction of this content is not guaranteed solely through the guarantee of the abstract form. Moreover, under capitalism, this material content stands in contradiction to its economic form, equality/freedom versus inequality/unfreedom, and is indeed jeopardized by that very form. Consequently, the state is charged with the task one that the capitalist production process cannot accomplish on its own, of guaranteeing the unity between the material and value-based aspects of the overall reproduction process. This guarantee manifests itself both in police and economic crisis interventions and in the safeguarding of the material conditions of existence for the commodity labor power. Quote, immediate, concrete, and purposive state power must be exercised not only to avert the danger the individual labor capacity might cease to function as an object of exchange on the market, the situations arising from the cyclical movements of capital valorization also compel the state apparatus to undertake situation-specific reactions, whether these be a welfare state or a police state nature. End quote. Direct interventions and coercive measures by the state are, therefore, to be regarded not merely as a characteristic of the external establishment of the preconditions for capitalist relations of production and exchange, in the wake of, quote, primitive accumulation, end quote, but also as a permanent component of state action under capitalism, serving as a guarantee of general conditions of production that lie beyond formal legal principles based on abstract personhood. Consequently, according to Preuss, direct situation-specific state measures, which do not address individuals as abstractly equal legal persons, do, quote, not merely constitute an exception to the rule of state power governed by general laws, end quote, but are rather to be understood as a, quote, dialectical element of contradiction, end quote, inherent in that very rule. If the legitimation of rule of law functions is now achieved through the very form of socialization, quote, foundation and legitimation reside in the same principles as the foundation and legitimation of equivalent exchange, ... The legitimacy of legality lies in the fact that it treats all human beings as equals, end quote. Then the state's function of taking specific measures also possesses a source of legitimation, namely its substantive functions or contributions to the system. Such legitimation through performance is, according to the basic law of the Federal Republic, institutionalized in two ways. Firstly, in the form of the social state clause in Article 20, and secondly, in the reservation regarding socialization in Article 15. These provisions must be understood as a legitimating formula for administrative measures aimed at guaranteeing certain general conditions of production within the capitalist mode of production. This explicitly contradicts Abendroth's view that Articles 15 and 20 possess the character of a political form for the systematic shaping of the social order as a whole. The substantive restriction of the socialization clause to, quote, land, nature, resources, and means of production, end quote, alone precludes the socialization of, quote, transport, insurance, and credit systems, end quote. Ultimately, the compensation required stipulated in the article confirms its function as a specific exceptional provision, a, quote, political reserve for action in, quote, emergencies, end quote, end quote. Quote, it invariably aims at compensating for the loss of substance regarding the socialized assets. It must therefore restore the capital of which the socialized assets were merely the material embodiment, end quote. The social-political dimension of the social state clause and of the specific constitutional articles permitting state intervention in the economy, a dimension rightly identified by Abendroth, and one that entails the incorporation of specific economic theories, denying the market the capacity for socially compatible self-regulation, can, according to Preuss, serve merely a legitimating function. There exists, quote, no possibility of its actual realization, quote. Secondly, however, there exists a requirement for the legitimation of state measures that extends beyond the scope of ongoing legitimation provided by specific welfare state clauses, given that such measures, quote, cannot be restricted to welfare state activities, end quote. Consequently, state interventions, ranging from infrastructure projects to repressive police or military functions, necessitate the search for an additional principle of legitimation that transcends the formal framework of the rule of law. In the Federal Republic, this principle was identified in the concept of the, quote, liberal democratic basic order, unquote. Quote, since freedom as a social form can only legitimize that which itself assumes this very form, and since conversely no other substantive forms of legitimation, aside from the limited welfare state provisions, exist within the Constitution, freedom was compelled to simultaneously fulfill the function of a substantive legitimation. The maxim, quote, no freedom for the enemies of freedom, unquote, implies that freedom as a social form cannot function in those instances where concrete measures of state coercion are required to guarantee the material and institutional conditions of capitalist valorization, end quote. Thus, freedom is transformed from, quote, a social form into a legitimizing content, end quote. However, this state of affairs cannot in principle be criticized from the standpoint of the Constitution's formal legalistic commitment to the rule of law, as constituting the institutionalization of a, quote, permanent state of exception, unquote, given that a bourgeois constitution is, quote, necessarily ensnared within the contradictory relationship between normality and exception, unquote. Two, according to Burkhart Tushling as well, the possibility of elements characteristic of a, quote, exceptional state, end quote, or, quote, interventionist state, end quote, within the very form of the state, or specifically within the separation between civil society and the state, is inherent per se. He begins by identifying a doubly contradictory relationship between commodity owners and the legal system. Within civil society, there exists a private law contradiction between the particular will of the individual commodity subject and that subject's general interest in the comprehensive, quote, guarantee of the private property relation as the fundamental legal form governing the relationships of individuals among themselves and with the socially available world of objects, unquote. For workers, this implies the simultaneous acceptance of their class position, constantly reproduced by the legally structured form of exchange, as owners of labor power who are separated from the means of production. For all exchange subjects, it implies the subordination of their particular private property to the requirements for the reproduction of private property in general. The private law contradiction is thus specifically linked to the rule of law functions performed by extra economic coercive power, namely the function of asserting the dominance of private property, if necessary even against the interests of specific individual private owners and private owning classes, and thereby guaranteeing the legitimate exchange-mediated transfer of property. The dominance of private property, therefore, does not entail any materially concrete security of ownership. Rather, it is necessarily compatible with the exploitation of the working class, the economically driven expropriation of capitalists, and statutory measures of expropriation undertaken by the state against the subjects who violate the law. Consequently, in order to guarantee the general framework conditions for their own mutually antagonistic and individually specific processes of reproduction, individuals must accept the possibility of their own dispossession, as well as their unconditional subjection to the collective interests of the capitalist system as a whole. Yet, superimposed upon this economically induced contradiction, which is situated within the sphere of domestic law, there now arises a second contradiction, that of public law, since the guarantee of the legal relations governing the circulation of commodities necessitates an extra economic coercive authority. Every individual must accept, indeed must will, their unconditional submission to this authority as well. For the very existence of this, quote, third instance constitutes the sole condition, quote, under which it is socially guaranteed to the individual, and indeed is guaranteed, that as a free and equal private property owner, He may enter into relations with all other individuals in this society, and within these relations realize his subjective ends in their socially determined form. End quote. Were he, in a case of dispute, to aggregate to himself the authority to adjudicate and enforce the law, the act of exchange would be subject to the arbitrariness and violence of a particular self-interested party to the exchange, a development that would, in the long run, dissolve the very nature of exchange, transforming it instead into a process of appropriation mediated by force. Consequently, since every commodity owner is compelled to will the existence of this coercive authority, including its legislative and judicial branches, he is simultaneously compelled to accept the possibility that the very authority responsible for establishing and guaranteeing the law might itself commit legal transgressions. Quote, the individual, therefore, who wills the legal order governing private property owners necessarily wills, by that very act, this legal order as a non-legal order. And this applies not merely in a material sense, unquote, as is the case with the substantive consequences of private law, quote, but also in a formal sense, the possibility that injustice may be perpetrated by virtue of the very law currently in force is inherent within the system of that law itself. Unquote. According to Tushling, this reveals the non-reflexive character of the legal order, specifically the fact that the relationship between the authority guaranteeing the law and those whose rights it guarantees cannot itself be subjected to further legal regulation, nor can it be structured as a relationship between free and equal individuals. Were it possible to substantively circumscribe the relationship between state and citizen through the law itself, the formal legal structuring of this relationship being, of course, a matter of doctrine and, as a rule, a reality in every constitutional state, this would in turn presuppose a coercive power superior to both the state and civil society alike, yet with respect to this superior power, the unconditional imperative of subsumption would necessarily have to apply as well. The attempt to legally reconcile the separation and subsumption of state and society would thus lead to a regressus ad infinitum, a fact which, moreover, serves to demonstrate the ultimately merely virtual character of international law. Consequently, the legal condition necessarily contains in itself the non-legal condition, and with it the permanent possibility of formal breaches of law and of the partial autonomization of this ostensibly sovereign coercive power vis-a-vis the ends of private owners and of private property itself, even if this relationship of subsumption can neither be abolished nor fully juridified within the framework of the capitalist mode of production, implying that, quote, the power relation involving the unconditional subordination of individuals to the state's guarantor power cannot be eliminated from the overall system, end quote. This power is nonetheless, when viewed from a perspective beyond the strictly legal, indeed bound and constrained. It acts simultaneously as both a superior and a subordinate subject, albeit in different respects, thereby constituting a materialist coercion to the Hobbesian theorem. For the state is, as Tushling argues, quote, superior to classes and individuals, yet subordinate to the purpose of capital accumulation and its attendant laws, end quote. At this juncture, we may refer to the arguments advanced by Blanca et al. Regarding the, quote, internal limits of the sovereign, end quote, specifically the operational and systemic boundaries of state action, limits which Tushling merely alludes to by pointing to the material dependence of state measures upon a successful process of capital accumulation and upon the economic power of the ruling class. Even a fascist state, too, is bound in this manner, and for the sake of its own self-preservation, cannot exercise absolute arbitrary rule. According to Tushling, the dimension of violence within the legal system
thus finds its limit in the suprapositive determinations of law. These in turn derive from the specifically social form of labor under capitalism and constitute fundamental requirements, quote, which every system of positive law must incorporate if it is to serve as the law of a bourgeois capitalist society, end quote. These determinations are thus suprapositive because they represent, quote, not non-eliminable constituents, end quote, of any positively enacted legal and private property order. They function as quasi-transcendental presuppositions of empirical law, and in this capacity serve as the standard for distinguishing right from wrong among state-enacted forms. Contrary to legal positivist or normativist approaches, law is not simply an arbitrary norm backed by the threat of state sanction, nor is it, however, an ahistorical determination of human nature or reason per se. Rather, as a historical a priori, that which qualifies as law under capitalism is, quote, everything that aligns with abstract private property, conceived as the fundamental legal relation, as the guaranteed general form of social organization, and as the supreme legal object of protection within society, end quote. Tushling. However, according to Tushling, a conditionally, quote, law-free space, end quote, exists not only between the state and its citizens, but also between legal subjects and their capacity as members of a class. The legal antinomy, identified by Marx, he argues, necessitates a struggle between classes, a struggle which by no means of, quote, force renders this antinomy amenable to resolution through conflict and institutionalizes it within the state in the form of compromised equilibria that are constantly shifting, albeit always within certain limits defined by the objective of capital accumulation. Consequently, class struggle is, quote, not a fortuitous interruption of economic or legal coercion. That is, not merely the trivial, isolated instance of a refusal to work or a violation of the law, end quote. Here, too, the, quote, exception is, as a rule, built directly into the legal system itself. Thus, for instance, if Franz Neumann denies National Socialism any legal character, arguing that the abstract general structure of bourgeois law was undermined therein through the discrimination of specific groups of persons, then his starting point may be understood as circulation-centric and idealizing, in the sense that it abstracts from the relations of production, their aspects of inequality, and their material preconditions. Okay. And that is the end of Chapter 3 of Part 2 of Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West, the new reading of Marx in the Federal Republic since 1965. Part 2 of the book is titled Derivation of the State, and Chapter 3 where am I? Am I reading the right thing? Sue me. Fuck, did I fuck this up? Oh, no. Sorry. Chapter 3 is titled In the Crossfire, Problematizations and Clarifications. And it had the headings, A Historical Materialism Without History, ? On the, quote, quote, economisms and, quote, circulationisms, dialectical development of legal and state forms, democracy and its revenants. Thank you so much for listening.